I'd like to welcome everybody back from lunch break.
I'll send you to the principal's office.
Do it. Where is that?
And I also would like to welcome Align, the Association of Community Services, who are going to be presenting for us. Now, I do have information here that says we've scheduled an hour and a half for the presentation and the discussion with the panel. As you're likely aware, we're already running a little bit behind, so I'm encouraging everyone to try their best to sort of talk fast and keep their questions and answers concise, so we appreciate that. And I believe you might have had a little instruction on the microphone situation, that everybody has to turn their microphone on and off, and then just be aware that we can only have 3 microphones live at any given time, otherwise they aren't recorded or picked up. So, and I'm not sure if we've got our phone callers back on the line. Heather, do we still have you with us, Jason?
Yeah, I'm here.
Awesome. And I apologize, Jason, I neglected to ask if you had questions in that last round, but I figured you'd jump in if you did.
I will, I'm not shy.
Perfect. All right, well, let's go on with our presentation. I've got Bruce Armson, the president, Rhonda Barraclough, executive director from Align Association of Community Services, and Anton Smith, Align member and group care representative. Take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for having us here this afternoon. My name is Bruce Armson, and I'm currently the president of Align. I'm also one of the co-CEOs for Unlimited Potential Community Services. And just before I turn it over to allow Rhonda and Anton to introduce themselves, just a little bit of background. I've been in the field for over 30 years and worked in a number of areas: group care, residential treatment, community services, foster care. And my wife and I were also foster parents for one of the DFNAs in the province for a little over 15 years as well. So, been around for a little while. We do have a few members that are with us today. Michelle Meadle from Pathways Family Services, Chris Larson from Mountain Plains, Catherine Jones from Alberta Foster Parent Association, and Melissa Gee from the Foster Parents Association as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Rhonda. Actually, we're doing 2 presentations. One will be on Align, the association, and then because group care, residential care is a fairly significant part of the system, Anton will also be doing a presentation on that. So I'll turn it over to Rhonda.
Good afternoon. As Bruce said, my name is Rhonda Barraclough, and just a little quick background for me. I too have been in the business for 29 years, and I started as a child and youth care worker in British Columbia, moved on to be a child intervention worker there and manager there, and then moved back to Alberta in 2001, where I worked for an agency around family violence, and then started working for the ministry here as a manager in Stony Plain, Spruce Grove, and in Central here in Edmonton. And after about 5 years, I left working for government and started my own consulting company working with agencies around strategic planning and leadership and supervision and mentoring. And then 10 years ago, started working at Align as the executive director. So I have a wide variety of experience as well in the child welfare system. So who is Align? Align is a representative membership organization that has been around for 50 years. The association used to be called the Alberta Association of Services for Children and Families, which is a very long handle that became very difficult to talk about. And Align started 50 years ago to try to work with government, to develop standards and both in the child care as well as in the group care area way back when. Interestingly, the agencies that started Align, which were Catholic Social Services, William Roper Hall Home in Calgary, and a few others, remain our members to this day and continue to work on those same issues, as well as issues around compensation and procurement. So our mandate is to serve as a community of agencies respecting the diverse needs of Alberta's children, youth, individuals, and families. We act as a collective voice, advocating for the rights, causes, and issues that directly affect our members, which for the most, we'll talk about who the members are, but essentially our members include agencies that provide everything from prevention, early intervention, any type of residential care, including foster care, family support, all those agencies you talked to on Monday around collaborative service delivery are our members. The contract foster care people that you'll hear about tomorrow are our members, and the group care providers, as well as home visitation, all the way to folks that provide independent services for kids. So we have a wide variety of folks who we work with. So we try to support excellence in service delivery through shared diverse knowledge, wisdom, and evolving practice. We influence and collaborate with government in the development of legislation, policy, and procedures. And for the most part, that is children's services and or community and social services now. But certainly we have participated in other ministries' activities like the mental health review that was done, some other healthcare and education things. But for the most part, our work is around children's services. So what we do. One of the things we do is advocacy. We speak on behalf of our members. We do a lot of professional development, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a bit, which includes training events, conferences, symposiums. We've also, for the last 10 years, helped with some leadership development in our sector. Just over 10 years ago, we received a bursary for $2 million from government. And in doing that, that $2 million has been spent over the last kind of 12 years between our sector and the folks providing services to disabilities in developing leadership within our sector. So we have some very well-educated folks that, thanks to that bursary, have been able to take leadership degrees, Masters of Business Administration, that kind of thing. Actually, we have just over 200 folks within the sector that have been able to take degree granting leadership programs, and then we also were able to evolve that into looking at leadership within organizations. And so in the last few years, we've had more and more agencies developing leadership within their organizations and supported by that bursary, which is now gone. We also look at policy development, research, and practice. We have a research practice journal, thanks to Bruce, actually. When he was on our board, he helped us develop that, and it continues. We work with government and others to have symposiums on areas of interest at the time. We've had 2 group care symposiums and a few other type things. We work on research projects with universities and others who are doing research projects out in the community. We also, obviously, as you've probably heard, partner with government to look at many of their initiatives around the practice framework, foundations of caregiver support, and others, and how those activities or those projects or initiatives or evolution of practice will affect agencies and or how agencies can impact that. Because you can't, in this system, as you probably have figured out, most of the service that's delivered to families is delivered through contracted agencies. The social workers that work within the system in children's services, for the most part, across the province do intake assessment and some work with families, but for the most part, the actual direct contact with families and for kids that require some pretty severe community treatment is done through an agency model. And it's not always clear that people understand that, and our agencies are contracted by government children's services to do that. So another initiative that our board has asked us to work on and that we are currently working on is occupational wellness and some occupational health and safety initiatives, as is government. The Ministry of Labor actually has just launched a wellness campaign around looking at violence in the workplace and are looking at the group care sector to see what trends are there and how government could also look at that. We also, one of the big things we do is look at workforce strategies, procurement, contracting, labor market issues. This is a very large workforce, and I'll talk about that in a second, that government is contracting with, and so there's significant challenges, issues, and negotiations that happen there, and I'll talk a bit more about that. And we also sit on the Child Welfare League of Canada Board of Directors. And actually, the other day, Greg, you asked about what do other people see in Alberta? And that's a good place, actually a good litmus test there, because there's people from across the province or across the country looking at child welfare across Canada, and they're very fascinated with what's happening in Alberta and actually see Alberta as a leader in collaborative service delivery and collaborative shared practice, and ask lots and lots of questions about it. And actually some of the other provinces have come here to talk with some of the agencies that do that work, or with us or with government, to see what they could do. So we have about 120 members, most of them the direct agencies. We also have other associations that are our members. So you've already heard about the Alberta Foster Parent Association is one of our members, the Child and Youth Care Association, the Alberta Home Visitation Network. So all of their members are also become our members by arm's length association. We also have a few learning institutes that are members of our associations, so Lethbridge College, MacEwan University, Mount Royal University. And most of our members are agencies that contract to children's services, and most of those agencies contract to other ministries as well, and not just for child intervention work. So a particular agency could have numerous contracts, either with community and social services and children's services and health or solicitor general or education, to do very similar work but across a number of ministries. In our case, we are focused on children's services and now community and social services as well. And again, as I said, this can run the gamut of services from anything from prevention to permanency. We are trying very hard not to make that a continuum, because you'll see as we talk about different types of care, we would like to revision how care for children happens and not see group care, for example, as the end of the road. We see it as a type of service that children need at a particular time in their lives. And what history has shown is it's used as a last resort. And we think that has something to do with why multiple placements and some of the challenges some of the young people have. So, but Anton will talk more about that. So obviously in child intervention, most of the services are direct services. The direct services to children and families are through contracts, not all, but about 80%. You saw and witnessed the collaborative service delivery model. We worked with the ministry and were at the table with the ministry when that started way back in 2008. Our perspective is different around how it started. It started as a financial request in a need to figure out how to make more flexible contracts for agencies to be able to manage and carry on. And as a result of trying to solve that problem, looking at outcomes became how we all agreed we should be working with kids and families. And then the practice shifted to looking at those outcomes and better practice, and money became less of an issue, not so much less of an issue, but how those contracts happen became less of an issue as the practice evolved. And then money followed in terms of the collaborative service delivery. So we have a different perspective on how it started, but we have all worked together with government over the years to try to look at how outcomes can change how practice happens, what's good for kids, looking at the incident studies and the research in terms of what works and how that works. And our role in Align is to make sure our members are aware of that and are using that data as well as they develop their, however they're going to work with their folks. And we'll talk a bit more about that. The other thing people should know, and I've heard it talked about here a couple times, but you may not really be clear on what it is. All contracted agencies who have a contract for child intervention, not necessarily prevention or early intervention, must be accredited. So there is a requirement of the ministry for those child intervention services to be accredited through certain specific accrediting bodies, and those bodies have been identified by government. So in all cases, there is a basic set of standards that the agencies are required to maintain as it relates to human services. And for the most part, and this is a generalization, right now, government has approved 3 accreditation bodies. There used to be 4, so there is actually 4 still in the mix until that cycle changes. But for the most part, the standards vary, but the accrediting bodies in all cases look at clinical leadership and governance of each organization, their people processes and their human resources management, their information and documentation, and their performance and client-based services. So when an agency is accredited, they are annually monitored by the accrediting bodies, so a third party. Their accrediting bodies come into their organizations and do significant reviews of all of these processes. So sometimes people ask us, like, why the agencies, like, what makes them legitimate? This is sort of how government has set up for the child intervention contracts, and everybody has to be accredited. So the agencies have a significant watchdog, so to speak, to them. As I talked earlier, and this may be hard to see, this is my depiction of my poor technical skills of a web as opposed to a continuum of services. So this is just a small example of what many of our members offer. So there's things like youth shelters, residential treatment, resource centers, which you'll be going to one in Calgary, community programs and counseling. Many of our agencies who have contracts for child intervention also do community activities. So they run boys and girls clubs or have walk-in counseling in their particular community that any community member could go to. Bentero is a good example of that, where you've been. Bentero obviously has child intervention services. They also have prevention and early intervention services because they have a parent link center and other types of services, but they also have just walk-in services for whoever lives in that community. Supervised visits, supported independent living, specialized services, children's crisis nurseries. There's 2 of them, one in Calgary, one in Edmonton. Those are actually early intervention or prevention placements for babies when families are in crisis. Collaborative service delivery, which you've met some of those folks. There are rural collaborative service delivery models as well, which I don't know if you saw on Monday. So there is a rural collaborative service delivery model that happens in the high-level area, and another one in central Alberta between Drumheller and Airdrie. And they, of course, have different models because they're in a different situation. So I'm not sure if those folks were here on Monday, but there's that. We have parent team programs, home visitations, family support, Head Start programs, youth and care mentoring, which is another project, therapeutic group care, secure services. Our members also provide secure services. So secure services in child and youth care are examples of government also provides those services. So Yellowhead Youth Center here in Edmonton is a government-run group care facility. And Unlimited Potential runs group homes here in Edmonton. So you have both in the same community. Secure services. The YAC in Lac La Biche has secure services, which stands for Youth Assessment Center, have a secure services in Lac La Biche, which is run by government. But in Calgary, secure services is run by Hull Family Services. So just an example of, there are lots of examples of Government has some services and agency has others. Foster care, you'll see us, we're doing a presentation tomorrow. Half the kids in foster care are in authority foster care, which is run by government. Half the kids in foster care are in contract foster care, which is through contracted agencies. And we'll talk about that tomorrow. This morning I heard a question about Aboriginal people who live in the cities and how do they get service and what happens there. Many agencies certainly in Edmonton, Calgary, and some of the rural communities have agencies that are very focused on Indigenous people, not necessarily solely Indigenous people, but you met people from Bentaro. There's another similar agency in Calgary, Pathways Family Services, which is an Aboriginal agency. Bencalf Robe here is also an Aboriginal agency. Mamatusquin, which is the collaborative service delivery, where you met in Calgary, is a collaborative service delivery model, which is 3 agencies. I don't know if they explained who they are, but that's Pathways, Big Brothers, or Boys and Girls Club, and Enviros in Calgary, run Mamatusquin. So there's lots of examples of Native Friendship Centers. Some are members, some are not, are examples of what you might call an Aboriginal service. So let's talk about the workforce. Contracts. Our members, we think, in working with the ministry, represent about 80% of the contracts and 80% of the work that's provided through contracted services for child intervention services. One of your slides early on said that equals $132 million. Our survey actually says it's worth more, it costs more than that, but it's how you decide where to cut the line. In 2016, the agency served about 202,000 children or families. You've seen data that says we have 4,000 FTEs. Those 4,000 FTEs in the child intervention contracted system, as well as early intervention and prevention, equal about 10,000 employees, which also is the disability world. About 7,000 full-time and 3,000 part-time employees. So, an FTE could mean more than one person, right? So that's how that equals that. So also in the accreditation process, there's educational expectations. So in the contracted agency sector, 37% of the folks working in that sector have a bachelor's degree, 31% have a diploma. That equals 68%. The other 30-some%, I would argue, have more than just a degree, including the 3 of us, actually. All 3 of us have master's degrees and are well educated in terms of the sector. So there's very few folks working in the contracted sector for child intervention that are not quite well educated. Turnover rates. 72.6% of the Aligned workforce have been employed less than 5 years. We have a challenge. Can you guess where they go? Government. Because of some of the procurement and contracting issues and the wages and lack of benefits within the not-for-profit sector. In 2016, at this point, we're concerned because in 2016, the turnover rate was 35% and it's increasing. As you'll see there, in 2014, the turnover rate was 25.7%. For the 3 years prior to that, we were able to work with government to ensure there was an injection of funds for wages. We increased the wages 15% in the 3 years before 2014, and that decreased our turnover rate significantly. So that's a challenge. Not unlike the DFNAs when they showed you their wage discrepancies. Our folks, so a child and youth care worker working at YYC here in Edmonton is making about 25% more, plus has a pension plan and benefits, than a child and youth care worker working at a well-funded agency like Unlimited Potential or Oak Hill. Okay, so that creates a discrepancy there and a challenge that we continue to work with government around. Pay and benefits is the main reason people give for leaving, and most staff move to government. And it doesn't mean they move to children's services, because most of them are well educated. They also go to health, education, solicitor general, a number of other folks will take them, and they're well-trained staff because they have to have the training to work in this field. So in 2014 was the last year of, I already said this, 3 years where we were able to secure wages as a stabilizing force in the workforce. Procurement. This is an area that we're struggling with at this point. Procurement is how we get contracts with the agencies. And I should say, Align does not have contracts with government. We are not a government-funded organization. We are a member-funded organization. We do have some contracts with government to do projects with them, where we sit at tables with them around policy planning. So an example being foundations of caregiver support, and some of the training we do is supported through the ministry, but it's not sustaining funding for us to run. Our members pay for us to be an association. So that's different than other sort of membership organizations that you might come across, like Alberta Council of Disability Services or Alberta Home Visitation, for example, is funded by government to be an association too. So we're a bit different that way. For the last year, there's been a procurement advisory table where agency has worked with government to try to figure out what's the best way to procure service. And that came about because of government's need to make sure procurement was done fairly for all. And so because as the Ministry of Human Services came together, there was a discovery that there was multiple ways that contracting was happening within that sector. And we agreed to work with government to try to streamline that and get to some sort of consistent way as government was doing that. That was over a year ago. Recommendations were made. Ministries have changed. We're not moving forward in procurement activities, partly because of this panel as well. I mean, it makes sense that Children's Services doesn't go out and procure things till some recommendations happen, but that is the only way agencies or people who have contracts get changes in wages, and is also the way that you make changes in how that service is delivered. And so that's where we have a bit of a challenge right now, is there needs to be some movement in procurement so that we can provide the services that whatever's recommended or what we think should be happening or what government thinks should be happening in that process. So it's a concurrent challenge at the same time that this is going on. And the procurement advisory table recommendations went to Minister Sabir, which is Community and Social Services. And so the two ministers have to figure out how to make that work as well. But it's just an example of sort of how we as a membership organization have to interact with government around those things. Overall operating costs have not kept up across the province for the most part. Operating costs, things like keeping the lights on, food for kids, etc., have not changed in 10 years. And if you have kids, you know that those costs increase. Carbon levies, there's no compensation for the carbon levies. The labor laws that came, or recommendations that came out this last week, will have a huge impact on us around bank time and having to pay at time and a half, because that's not been the process. So those are all things that we need to get talking to government about some more. And there's some regional inconsistencies. That seems to be starting to sort itself out now that there's John Reeves and Russ Pickford are trying to get more consistent around children's services and child intervention services. That also is becoming more consistent in how contracted agencies can do their work and their contracts. So why contract with contracted agencies, you might ask? Some of the reasons why we think, and obviously we have a vested interest, but we also think the folks working in the bureaucracy think this, is that the agencies are more nimble. They're able to change, negotiate, work with families and children, and be much more nimble in the programming that they offer. They also can wrap services around a family in a day. And you've heard that through the collaborative service delivery, that one of the things they've learned is early intervention, getting people in those families really quick, and not necessarily between 8:15 and 4:30, is one of the ways to help reduce the number of kids that come into care. So those agency folks are going out and working with those families at that time. We're nimble, we have flexible staffing, we do have the ability to alter work hours. You'll see when we talk about group care and when we talk about foster care, we have a stringent accrediting process, so people are having to meet certain standards. We also have an incredible amount of research going on in the agencies in Alberta. So you'll hear Anton talk a bit about that through group care, but organizations like Hull Homes in Calgary or Hull Community Services in Calgary are leading experts in NMT. Anton's organization is a leading expert in the care model. They have people that teach internationally in these models, and almost all of the agencies are stepping up to the plate to do some of this research and use researched models within their organizations. The agencies are community-based. They work within their communities. They know who's in the community. They can adjust themselves to work with the community. One of the collaborative service delivery models here in Edmonton works with Ubuntu, is working with a community that has some significant refugees folks coming in here and different cultures that we haven't worked with for years, and they've been able to sort of organize themselves and learn about those communities very quickly. And we find that in government that doesn't happen so quickly. We also like to work as partners with government and can sort of give the other side of the picture in terms of the service delivery people when policy is used. People are well supervised. And of course, even though we talk about procurement and challenges and $132 million, if it was all in government, it would be a lot more expensive. For example, the agencies themselves own their own property. If those services were provided by government, you have to find property to do that kind of stuff. You have to, unions, you have more, while we would like to see benefits and wages increased in the sector, there's no way that it would be cost effective to be in government. Not saying that people couldn't do it, but. So I think I've talked about all of these, but in our professional development area, I talked about the leadership bursary. We also have done significant work within our agency and with the organizations through our Aboriginal Advisory Group. And we have done a number of things. Some of the things Patty was talking about this morning. We've offered training in family group conferencing, but we use the Blue Quills model, which is, you had a different name for it this morning. Circle, a particular type of circle model, which is came out of that, or they've evolved.
No, it's our own, but yeah.
But family group conferencing is a model. Circle processes, we've spent a lot of time working with the agencies around intergenerational trauma. We've developed 2 programs with University of Calgary. One is called Omanto and the other is called Align Cultural Solutions. Those are 4-day experiential experiences. I don't know what else you call them because it's not just training, it's an experience where we have elders, and in Omanto's case, Dr. Ralph Botter from the University of Calgary, and Align Cultural Solutions, a man by the name of Adrian Goulet, who is an Aboriginal man who's working with now he's working actually at Hull, and Dr. Reg Croshu and Dr. Leona Makokas, and they have developed this experiential, I'll call it training with us and with our Aboriginal Advisory Group. Our advisory group basically said to us, agencies need to have that kind of experience. U of C is offering it through Ralph and Leona. You need to get them to change it for agencies, and then let's deliver it. So the ministry has helped us with a training grant to help deliver that. So what happened is Ralph and Leona, who is an elder from Saddle Lake and was the president of Blue Quills, developed this program for U of C. They then revised it for frontline workers. We send people, agencies send people to it, and then About 3 years ago, we asked Calgary to develop a similar thing because, as you all know, folks in Edmonton, a lot of them are Cree, and Omanto is a Cree-focused training or experience. Aligned Cultural Solutions was developed by through Leona and Dr. Botter with Adrian and Dr. Croshu in Calgary, and it talks more about some of the other cultures that are living more in southern Alberta, so Blackfoot, Tsuut'ina, a little bit different perspective, but in the whole thing they talk about intergenerational trauma, stories, traditions, and it's all done in ceremony. And it's a 4-day experience. We offer that also to government employees if they want to go. We've had a few that go. We have more folks actually from the educational system and other systems that want to join us. So that's been an example of where we've tried to pick up and offer agencies tools to work with Indigenous folks. We've also done all those other things that are there. And we continue to develop different professional development stuff, and we offer it across the province for our members on top of whatever they're doing already with their folks. We've also held 2 group care symposiums with the ministry where we brought in experts in group care over 3 years, and we hope to have the 3rd one. We said we would have 3 to look at group care and how group care should be delivered and what some of the international research is around group care, and Anton will talk a bit more about that. So we sit at all of these tables, which I think I don't even need to explain all the acronyms to you now. You've probably got them figured out. Collaborative Service Delivery Table, the Practice Framework, the Foundations of Caregiver Support, Signs of Safety, Family Find. We've had a group care committee, and any other policy and procedures initiative that government has, they ask us to sit at those tables, and we do, which is a good thing. So overall systems change. To change and improve the system, we believe there needs to be a reformed funding model and a flexible funding model. And we need to talk about how that looks and that our staff have livable wages, which some don't at this point. Fuller and further implementation of community and collaborative service delivery. That doesn't necessarily mean it has to be CSD as it is, but the collaborative service delivery and partnership, shared service delivery certainly seems to be the way to go. Subsidized and supported kinship and guardianship, and we'll talk more about that tomorrow. Advancement of post-care services, not just financial. So one of the areas that we're very concerned about, and we'll talk about it again with foster care tomorrow, is kids that are aging out of care and getting post-care services. A lot of those are financial services and not support services, and we're worried about those kids. And so we'll spend some more time talking about them tomorrow. Obviously, trauma-informed and evidence-based supportive practice for both contracted staff and ministry staff. A broader, more inclusive look at poverty, homelessness, mental health services, and certainly mental health services for youth, especially as they transition to adulthood. Systemic leadership changes, ongoing indigenization of the system, whatever that's going to look like, and Indigenous and provincial economic factors are obviously issues. How am I doing? Going fast. So our recommendations are we figure out a way to develop clear, flexible, well-funded procurement process, that family-centered decision-making is used, that the foundations of caregiver support are the foundations of all training, and certainly in our case, we've already have started training in the agency sector in those particular areas. It's a little bit slower for the ministry staff. We believe collaborative service delivery and whatever that looks like is important, and we do happen to think the collaborative service delivery, or what was formerly known as OBSD, are good examples. Treatment resources like treatment group care, which Anton will talk more about, need to be considered and thought about very carefully in the model of care for young people. Young people don't grow up overnight. They need more support in their early 20s. And if children are not able to remain with their parents, we agree that kinship care should be looked at, but that kinship care needs to be supported. And we'll talk more about that tomorrow when we talk about foster care. So we also believe that there needs to be some work done in multi-ministry and multi-government. Mental health services, I don't think it's a surprise to anybody. Mental health services are not adequate for kids, certainly not for kids in care, and certainly not as they transition to the adult services. That needs to be, more work needs to be done on that. Collaboration between the ministries needs to also be beefed up. There's a lot of barriers for children in care when it comes to other systems like health and education and Solicitor General. And so, you can't just change this system without impacting those other systems, or in fact, I would argue impacting some of those other systems would help this system. And so that's a huge challenge. Larger social issues like poverty and homelessness need to continue to be worked on. Indigenizing the system, we certainly don't want to tell how the system should be, but things like in Jordan's principle, mentoring of agencies, training to agencies, and certainly our agencies would be more than happy to work with DFNAs and others, and in fact do have some of DFNA kids in their resources, but there is not the greatest relationship there, and that I don't know how that will get fixed, but should be. And we also, like we recommended with the Office of Child and Youth Advocate legislation, and believe that government could encourage the federal government to look at a children's commissioner, which would look at the rights of Indigenous kids in care federally and could maybe have some influence in that area. So at this point, we want to turn over to Anton to talk a little bit about group care. And the reason we did this is, as we talked about, we've spent the last 3 years or more working with government about what should group care look like. And there's some significant work that's been done there, and it wasn't fit into the schedule. So we wanted to make sure you heard about those kids and about that work. Do you want me to take questions now about a line or wait to the end?
I think maybe we should wait till the end just because we're late on time, and that way we could be maybe more efficient. If everybody in the panel is okay with that?
Okay.
So how do I do this?
I'm not sure if you're in that.
No, this is mine.
So we need it loaded, the other one loaded on.
Yeah, the other one?
Will it take long? Because we could entertain a question in the meantime. Or it'll only take a second? Okay, Patty, go ahead if you want to do it really quick while we're loading
Just
it up.
wondering, for the Secretariat, I see that there's $132 million in contracts that we were told. I would like to know what the percentage of that money goes to Indigenous organizations. I'd also like to know what the percentage of that money goes to church-based organizations, if that information could be made available to us, please. Thank you.
All right, we'll see what we can do in terms of pulling by what we know as vendor ID.
Or even just who they are that get, like if you have a list. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, we'll follow up and try to get it roughly right.
Thank you.
So we're good to go on? All right, thank you. First of all, just thanks for hearing us out, and particularly and specifically in terms of therapeutic group care and therapeutic residential care. As Rhonda said, we talked that there had been a fair amount of work that had been completed in residential care. We spent about 2 years with some of the folks from government in terms of really trying to define and work through what are some of the active ingredients that really affect change for young people. And so when I put this together and when we looked, we also published a paper, and the The paper was called A Renewed Perspective of Group Care and Residential Care, Orientation to Therapeutic Group and Residential Care, and I believe you have that in the package. And I'm going to go fairly fast. I've got a number of slides, so I'm hoping throughout the presentation I'll try and touch on some of the key points, but there's a lot of information here. One of the things that we know about group care and residential care is that we know a lot. There's a great deal of literature. There's a great deal of research in this area of work. And what we also know is that we don't always practice that way, and historically we haven't practiced that way. And so there's been this big gap between what we know and what we do. And so it's certainly been our passion and our forward motion in terms of trying to close that gap, right? We want to be able to close the gap so what we know is actually integrated into what we do, and that's really been the crux. And in terms of my own personal orientation, when I started at Oak Hill 12 years ago, that was really when they asked me in my interview what they asked me to say, or asked me what I was good at, and I said I was good at integrating theory with practice. And so hence I continue that journey and continue that mission of trying to integrate theory with practice. Sometimes I do it better than others, but nevertheless. I should also just, maybe I should just mention, just give a little bit of background on myself. I've worked in the system for over 30 years. I spent my first 5 years in British Columbia as a child and youth care worker, working in a group home in Surrey, British Columbia, and Prince George. I did a little bit of work up in the Yukon for youth services. And then since 1990, I've worked in the Edmonton area as a child and youth care and as supervisor and manager, and I've worked across most of the intervention areas in family services and supported independent living, in foster care and in treatment foster care, in group care, and for the last 12 I've been very focused on residential treatment. I'm actually here also representing the group care folks within the province, particularly the group that Rhonda talked about, and also there was key people that when we were preparing to come here today, that that input has been integrated into the presentation that you're about to hear. One of the things that's happening internationally is because group care and residential care looks so different from different perspectives and where it's located and who's doing it, and so it anywhere from a shelter program to a small community group to residential centers and campuses, and some have special focuses where they're working with kids that are very sexualized, or they might have a special focus with fetal alcohol. And so there's a whole notion of this. And so what is happening currently internationally is they're really trying to come up with a consensus definition. And so there's a group of experts and academics internationally that have been meeting over the last several years that are trying to build a definition. And this is the definition that they've currently came up, and it's published in Whitaker, who is from Seattle, Deval, who's from Spain, and Holmes, who's from England. They published a book, Therapeutic Residential Care in International Perspective, and they've got a number of articles within that book from all across the world, the Western world. So some of the things that they talk, it's a complex definition. When you look at it, it looks complex, and that's because it is complex. And so when we talk about having planful and purposeful, constructed, multidimensional living environments, that's when you really actually start to think about how complicated those terms are and what that actually means, it is very complex, right? And so we do that in terms of focusing on the treatment for kids, on their education, on their socialization and the support. And that while doing that, we need to be able to protect the children with mental health and behavioral needs, collaborate with a full spectrum of services, and in partnership with their family and the community, using both formal and informal supports. These three definitions are in the paper that I referenced. and a little bit more comprehensive than I've got them on the slides here. And I'm just going to touch on how we came to this. So when we were doing the literature review for that article and how we were also trying to construct what was representative of what we were seeing in Alberta. And so we came up with 3 types of residential care. And that was campus-based therapeutic care, therapeutic community care, and community group care. Now, the term therapeutic in those first 2 definitions really comes from the work of Henry Meyer and what he would call second order of change. And so just to talk very briefly about second order change, if you think of first order of change as the type of change the type of environment that kids need to naturally develop. We know that children will do well if they can, and if you can think of that kind of environment, they would just naturally develop. We work with a population that have developed different adaptive skills, and so a lot of the work in second order change is about trying to undo some of the complexities and some of the problems and to teach them new ways, more successful ways of being able to function. And so that's really when we look at that term therapeutic in those first 2 definitions, that we look at that word as therapeutic as being of that nature. And I'll talk about very briefly some of the differences between campus-based and therapeutic care. They're arranged in the structure, going from more intensive to less intensive. Campus-based being more intensive, and less intensive would be more community-based group care. Campus-based group care, some of the strengths of that is around the education. Programs are typically on campus, and so kids go to school there. Actually being on campus, they have an ecology that you can create and shape so that kids can be successful in their daily activities and that they can develop self-efficacy in terms of who they are. When we talk about therapeutic community group care, one of the things that really stands out is the real strength here is actually located in the community, whereas campus-based group care is on a campus and it's a community unto itself. And so it's more for children that have really struggled living in a family, living in a community, whereas in therapeutic community care would be more orientated to kids that can and are able to function in community, but perhaps not in a family setting. And community care, we orientated it around what we call first order of change. And this is really providing a good environment that's nurturing, that's safe, that's role modeling, that's teaching, doing skill development. But it's very much more of a normalized kind of setting, except it's a staffed environment. And this would be for kids that really struggle with the intimacy of the family, but are generally doing fairly well. They're going on a reasonable trajectory. We talk about the purpose of residential care, it creating some breathing room for kids for children to focus on themselves in a safe place and within the environment. The idea of moving from what we would call a traditional boot camp environment to moving more towards what we would create as a monastery environment, that we actually give them some space and some breathing room, that they're able to learn from staff that act as teachers and coaches and mentors, that they receive interventions that are orientated in evidence-based practice, and that they help children realize a stronger developmental, more normalized developmental trajectory. And so what we're trying to do in residential care is often we have kids that have mental health issues, or we have kids that are demonstrating some delinquency or some violence or struggling regulating their emotions. And the idea is that we're trying to bring them back onto a normal path of development. So why choose therapeutic group living? One of the things that we know is that most of our kids are best served in a family. most of our kids are best served in a family setting. We all know that. We agree with that. That's a basic belief that goes on. However, for some kids, they're best served in a therapeutic residential care. And there's a portion of kids that don't handle the intimacy of a family very well. They need multiple opportunities to develop attachments. They need an ecology that can be changed, that where they can be successful. That it's a lot easier to change the environment than it is to change the child in those particular moments. We can look at that once they start to be successful. Some of the benefits as a service. It has some of the it has low maltreatment rates compared to other out-home services. I think a hospital setting is the only service that has lower. It typically demonstrates improved child functioning, demonstrates improved academic performance, and less intensive post-discharge outcomes. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we talk about active ingredients. What are these critical components that need to be present within a group care or a therapeutic group care program? And so one of the things that we know is that there needs to be a well-defined, a well-articulated program model. And you can see that I've identified a few that are current in Alberta, and that there's organizations using the three that I've listed here. One of the challenges with this is the fidelity, that it's one thing to pick up a model that's evidence-based or evidence-informed, but you have to implement it as it's designed or it loses its effectiveness. We can't dilute it, we can't take portions off, we have to implement it in a full way, or we're not really operating. And so when we sign up for these models and we buy into these evidence models, that one of the challenges is that we really struggle with some of the maintaining the fidelity, and the costs are typically costly. The other thing with a well-defined program model is it really helps the organization establish congruence, that the system throughout the organization, the principles that are used within the organization are what all the organization are using. The second ingredient that is important in therapeutic care is this notion of therapeutic milieu. That this is the life space. This is where they're living, and it's more than just the therapy hour. Treshman, Brentro, and Whitaker wrote a book, The Other 23 Hours, and that was really what it was designed to look at. It was to look at what goes on in the life space of the child. There's been lots of books and literature published around the life space since, but these are some of the key things that are important when we're talking about what is happening in the milieu, that it's safe, that nobody can learn anything without it being safe, that the relationships are developmental relationships, that we're actually focused on forming attachments, that we're looking at progression, we're looking at inclusion, and so these are kind of themes that would come out as we're looking at developing relationships with kids. That it's trauma-informed, that we're looking at emotional and working with the child's emotional regulation, and that all the activities within the setting are purposeful and planned. That we know in these settings, when we get child-led activities, often we get problems. The other thing that we know that many of our kids require specialized education services. That, and I think this is one of the strengths for campus-based programs, is that they show incredible, very good outcomes in attendance and academic performance. And good schools that are on campus children are learning about 2 grades per year. And that's typically because they're also so far behind that they come to the programs, they've been in and out of school for several years, there's big gaps, they've been for many different schools, and so this is one of the strengths. Some of the community group care programs have very specific schools, and then there's other community group care programs that also use other resources like Success in School to help children within the community schools. We know that there's two very clear indicators for good outcomes in residential care, and that is that there's family involvement and family services, and that there's aftercare support. These are clear indicators of good outcomes. They're essential to achieve good outcomes in therapeutic care or group care. And they need to be integrated into the organizations that are providing those services. They need to practice from the same modalities and program modalities that those organizations are working with. The clinical services and health services, most have some psychological services. These come in two ways, either therapy, and therapy works on about 20% of our kids. A lot of it comes from the program oversight, the clinical oversight that's provided to the program, and the supporting the staff with their approach to the children and to the programs that they're participating in. Health services, both psychiatric and nursing, and I also noted occupational therapy, are gaps in a lot of our programs. Another active ingredient is that there's Indigenous services that is actually integrated into the program, that there's elders involved in the program, that they're active in the program in terms of teaching the young people, that they actually help provide program oversight, and that there's some method of keeping connections with the communities of origin. And then lastly, I just wanted to briefly say about a crisis management system, that organizations that are providing this need to have a system. This isn't simply just training staff in crisis management. This is integrating a system into policy, into their leadership, into their feedback, into incident monitoring. And so it's much broader than that. And it's not good enough just for organizations to make up their own crisis management systems. I'm going to switch gears and talk a little bit about these two international movements that are currently underway. We have there's a move at the United Nations level to eliminate congregate care, largely in Eastern Europe and Southern African countries. And also there's been some real push from the Annie Casey Foundation in the US. They published a paper called Right-Sizing Congregate Care. I'm going to note that congregate care is a very old term, comes from the 1900s. It's rare that we see that now. That's the first movement. The second movement, and of course I'm biased, is a movement that I'm very encouraged by, is this rethinking, this reappreciation of residential care. And that's showing up in Western Europe, in North America and Australia, and we're also seeing it to seep into other countries like Japan and Hungary and Brazil. Some of the outcomes to these two movements is that we're seeing this increasing focus on this term, therapeutic residential care. And one of the articles with the Whitaker article that I enclosed builds around that consensus. So they're actually looking at, that definition I showed you at the start, as well as some of the principles around that. What we also know with the first movement is that there's been a number of attempts to eliminate residential care settings, and they've all been unsuccessful. And those that have taken it too far end up in a rebuild, and they struggle to, they look outside of jurisdiction for those kind of resources, or they set kids up into individual places with staffing, and they lack the active ingredients I just talked about. And so you get a substandard service for higher cost. So when you have a look internationally, you can see where Alberta is in terms of the percentage of kids in out-of-home care that are in group care placements. So I can tell you I do some consulting for Cornell University in Ithaca, and I spend some time in Australia. I know Australia reasonably well. That was at 6% then. They're more closer to 8% now, and we're seeing that being a growth area for them. In Ireland, they're getting closer to 10%. Alberta here, recently I got the number from Align, which was 10%, and then England. So you can see that we're at a fairly critical threshold in terms of what the makeup of is the system. I'm not going to go into this slide too much. This is more about what this international group is going, and I've attached that article. We see one of the challenges is that often residential care is used as a last resort, and this is not promising in terms of how we provide services. We're seeing the complexity of problems that kids come with become more severe. And I know when I went back to data 10 years ago, kids were coming in terms of internalized and externalized behavioral scores at the 89th percentile. And today they're at the 99th percentile. That's 10 percentage points when we do that measurement. And that's really significant. When I ask my colleagues, they say the same thing, that we're seeing a greater number of kids that have very complex problems within this service. What happens often with kids that go through the system, that what we need to do is get good assessments at first, and so we get so if they're needing residential treatment, or a group care setting on the onset, that we need to be able to learn to identify that on the onset. And so it becomes a treatment of choice, and then sometimes it might be a treatment of first choice. And so what we have is currently is this process of failure, that kids will often come in, they'll receive supports, family supports, they won't work, and this is just for this population, right? And so they don't work, they go into kinship care, it breaks down, they go into foster care, it breaks down, and then they get into group care, and then maybe even residential treatment. And so they go through this significant process where the initial problems are compounded by the failures that they've had within the system itself. Finally, I took this quote from a paper that was done by Sunsuri out of California, and he says, finally, although there is a reluctance to place children in high-level programs, the children are generally first required to fail at low-level programs. That's that fail to proceed. The result of this study indicates that when we properly assessed and placed into appropriate level care at the onset, the majority of children exit residential care system altogether, return home to a home-like setting sooner and at a lower cost. What am I doing for time?
It's 2 o'clock, I think.
What time did we have till?
No more time.
No more time? All right.
Just so people are aware, there's 503 children in group care and 198 children in treatment care as of March 2017 within our system, which is essentially 10%.
So the last 2 slides are just slides of some of the current challenges and the considerations that are worth looking at in residential care. So I'll leave it at that.
Excellent. So we have about 10 minutes that we can do some questions. Greg.
I'm going to defer my question, actually, and reflect on more.
Okay. Graham.
Thank you, Chair. So you've been Alliance, well, under a different name at first, has been dealing with residential care since 1967. So over the times, you've probably seen the evolution in relation to residential care. So I'm going to kind of ask you 3 questions in relation to that. What changes have you seen over the past 40 years, the past 10 years? And what changes do you think are needed moving forward, especially as we look at recommendations through the TRC and reconciliation as well?
That's a big question. So the last 40 years, I think what we saw 40 years ago was programs that were, at least the literature was very orientated in behavioral types of programs, that very control-based programs, that boot camp kind of mentality that we know that's not very successful. We can make kids do what we want, and you can put a gun to anybody's head and get them to do what you want, but that doesn't bring change, right? What we want is kids to internalize change. And so I think what we've seen is a real shift away from that boot camp kind of mentality and that mindset shift that we need to do some things differently. I think in terms of there was a real gap, particularly in the 80s and 90s, between what we did and what we know. I mean, I remember working as a child care worker in a group care program, and we would give out cigarettes as they did their chores, and we used to give push-ups, right? We used to give up push-ups for swearing. I mean, these were kind of archaic practices that we did back then. And that wasn't just in one program. That was an acceptable practice. And so what we've done is we've seen a real change in that closing that gap is really been happening. And so you wouldn't see any of those practices. Well, at least I shouldn't say that. I would hope you wouldn't see any of those practices. And I think the organizations wouldn't support those kind of things now. And I think in the last 10 years, we've seen a real evolution around some of the trauma research that has come out, that we've seen a shift in really trying to understand pain-based behavior, that the emotional pain is not that much different than some of the physical pain. Actually, it's more complex. How we respond to it is coming from that nurturing way, not trying to punish tantrum behavior, that this is emotional pain. And so we've also had a lot of focus on self-regulation and helping kids learn to regulate by co-regulating with them. I think those would be some of the key things. There's probably a lot. I could probably talk for a lot longer. But
The other part I would add to that is when I was a child and youth care worker, you never saw a family. Kid went into group care, that was the end of the connection with the family. And I believe now in the last 10 years, there's been lots more work with the group care field and residential treatment around working with families to sort of treat or work with everybody as a whole unit. And that would have been one of the significant changes.
And I think the last part of your question was what needs to, and I think that I think Anton did a pretty good job identifying those things in the presentation, but our current system and the programs that we're currently operating were contracted 10 years ago. And so for all intents and purposes, although we're making changes, we're still operating under systems that we were contracted for 10 years ago. We're well aware of changes in practice that need to occur, and that's really the reason for this presentation, and where we actually can operate services that are more engaged with family, more engaged with community, and have that, not only the front end, but the back end piece of work that all of us have known for years is missing. And so those are some of the big things that I think need to happen. And it's a shift in current contracting to actually get those to be able to do that. There's a huge change in, as Anton and Rhonda both said, in a move towards trauma informed, and so understanding trauma, intergenerational trauma, and certainly wouldn't say that everybody's an expert at it. I would say that we're on a journey. We recognize the importance of it. We recognize that we've missed it, and we're moving towards creating systems that actually can address those things. And part of that trauma, and from the system we use, which is called Sanctuary Model, is really, it's not just looking at the children, youth, and families we work with, but also the workers that work with them. And because the trauma impacts all of us.
I also think there's been an evolution over the last 10 years as well of looking at the Aboriginal or Indigenous issues with this kids that are in those resources and getting the resources that those organizations need to work with those folks and their families and get them back to their communities. And as Anton said, that's sort of one of the ingredients that needs to be there. That's not in the contracts either.
go with Greg, followed by David.
Thank you. What I've been reflecting on is this is not a world that I'm familiar with. And so we've heard a lot from Indigenous people and chiefs and people who had lived experience and DFNAs. And so we're talking about residential care. And I'm just on the slide here that says, why choose therapeutic group living? First off, I'm not sure anyone chooses therapeutic group living, I'm sure. But there's a couple of points I just want to talk about in an Indigenous context. Children who can't handle the intimacy of a family, and the third point, children who require an ecology where they can be successful. And you've gone on to talk about some of the work that you do with elders and Indigenous communities. I guess I'm just curious about what unique considerations that you take into account for Indigenous children. And if you feel that this approach is at odds with Indigenous culture, have you engaged with Indigenous communities, with chiefs, with elders, to answer those sorts of questions and knit those things together as best you can, or explore alternatives?
If I was to go to my organization, I was to ask the elder that we work with, he would say good things. I'm sure it would depend on who you asked and their past experience and the type of answer you have. What we know is that about, at least in group care and residential care, about 50% of our kids are First Nation or Métis. And so it's essential that there's an integration in terms of these cultural healing practices. And I think one of the challenges is actually reconnecting kids back to their communities of origin. And that often becomes a challenge. It's not as difficult to have elder services as present within your organization doing cultural practices as it is actually trying to link them back into their community. And I remember an Ojibwe woman saying to me, it's really hard to know where you're going if you don't know where you're from. And so that quote always sits with me. So it's certainly a significant challenge.
I think the other thing is when you look at most of the residential care in Alberta, it's obvious that they are working from an ecological model in terms of, if you go to the Boys Ranch, it's a ranch, they have horses, they have activities for the kids there to do that are very sort of earthy things. Byros in Calgary runs a wilderness camp as part of their group care. And so they have a variety of ways of ensuring that young people are connected to the land and connected to their cultures. It's not something that's completely 100% great, but it's certainly moving that direction.
I think that there's a couple pieces. Quite frankly, if the system, group care, didn't need to exist, we'd be happy to have it gone. I think part of the message that we're trying to get across here is that the way the system is working, it's kids move through the system based on failure. And so there's lots of kids that are ending up in very specialized programs because the system is based on a model of failure. And if the system was based on what's best for this child, this family at this point in time, there would be a significant difference in those kids, in the numbers of kids that we see. And just to be clear, lots of us contract with DFNAs. They access our resources directly. So it's not like we're only working with kids from provincial child welfare resources. We work with kids directly from DFNAs. And I think that if we can shift the system, we'll find that there's less kids coming to us because they're not in that system of failure. So.
We also know that about a third of the kids in group care right now are misplaced. They are kids with severe disabilities, and there needs to be a different model, which we are going to work with government around, but they get placed there because there's nowhere else for them to go. And that's not an appropriate placement most of the time. either. And those kids with severe disabilities and their families deserve a different kind of service, but that's what they get.
Okay, I've got 5 more people on my list and we're way out of time. So just a reminder, David?
Thank you very much. Rhonda, I think you spoke about collaborative service delivery. We've heard mixed messages about how it's working. What would you say it needs to change to optimize collaborative service delivery in our children's services?
To be brutally honest.
Yeah, go ahead.
Collaborative service delivery works when the supervisors and managers from within those communities get it. It doesn't work when they don't get it. Partnerships, collaboration are skills and supervisory things that need to be developed within both the agency sector and the children's services sector. Agencies are used to it because they do it all the time in all kinds of ways, whether it's with schools or health or children's services or whatever. They're there to help people become well. I'm sort of using that in the big term. Frankly, collaboration needs both sides of the fence, and that means the people working on the other side, whether that's DFNAs or children's service workers or whoever the other side is, need to share the responsibility of helping these families, and sometimes that doesn't work so well. And I think it's a challenge of a system that's not very nimble, a challenge of a system that has historically been full of barriers and a power imbalance with people. And I've been that person too. I've apprehended those kids and knocked on the door and done things that I would never do now. But partnerships and collaboration are not an easy thing. Even when we started OBSD in 2008 and 2009, that was a huge struggle between management of our 2 organizations to talk about and share healthy, developmental well-being and get to good outcomes for families. And so I think there's a challenge within, I'll just say within the ministry, in terms of what the senior management believe and want and work well is in partnership, and the front line doesn't always go down to the front line. And I see that in both with the agencies and child intervention, but certainly more within child intervention, as a challenge of supervision and that management level. They've got so much stuff going on and they sometimes just don't get it.
Quick follow-up, if I may. Is it related to policy or is it related to attitude?
Both. Policy hasn't always kept up, but it couldn't keep up. There's no way it could keep up in as fast as that has evolved. They're working on trying to change that policy. We'll talk more about policy for kids exiting care, where there is policy and practice doesn't follow that policy. But it's also attitude. Some people just, when you start in children's services, especially if it's not in the recent last 10 years, it was very much a power-based colonial system. And you had power and delegation and responsibility, and you take that very seriously. Sharing that is not an easy thing, and it's a skill that we weren't taught back then, and you have to be able to sort of let go a bit of. And there's a risk and concern within the folks in the ministry about, if I make the wrong decision, what will happen? That's still there. Those skeletons are there. So I think it's both.
Nicole, followed by Bruce.
Thank you for your presentation. So I have a background also in group care. I worked there for many years. And I know in group care, there's often isolation from family. So can you explain how you support engaging family with the youth and children that are in your care, and how you are able to assist with transition, working with that family from when they're leaving group care?
Talk specific to my experience. One of the challenges is we're typically not funded for family services or aftercare services within our contracts, and so what ends up happening is we take the base funding and shift it around to try and create space. As I said the two key indicators for successful outcomes is family services and aftercare support. In our organization, we actually have family services within the organization where we have independent family support workers that work directly with the families, that liaise with the families and the childcare staff, and that the families are actually not only we involved in their lives in their homes, but they're involved in the work that's going on in the facility as well. I don't think this is much different from other organizations. We certainly, I mean, it's certainly been a big gap in residential care, no matter what jurisdiction you look at. But I think we certainly push forward. What really needs to happen, that kind of programming needs to get supported. Because we're kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul in terms of trying to get that. And it's an essential component, right?
That's also one of the things I define as collaborative service delivery. If the group care folks could have that as part of the work that they do, they would collaboratively work with whomever needs to be worked with to get those kids back to their communities, their homes, their community, whatever, their schools. And they've all committed to doing that. We need just a process to get that as a way for them to do the work.
Bruce, followed by Patty.
Great, thank you all for your presentation. I've got a lot of questions. I'm going to limit it to one, and Rhonda, for you. You've talked about Align and your member organizations being a very nimble body, that you're able to respond to quick needs and help out. I also know that you're almost early warning signal. You can see what's happening in the field and kind of get a sense of the trends. Looking at emerging trends, changes in population, differential response, things that are working well, things aren't working well. What type of feedback loop do you have going back to your funders, back to children's services that get that early warnings about changing trends back to the funders?
Well, we've developed a relationship with the folks within this ministry and other ministries, so it's very easy for us to just have a conversation with them for the most part. We've also developed advocacy strategies that sometimes are more public around what's good for kids and families. We've also had to figure out and learn where and when, political cycles, for example, when it's good to talk about things and when it's not. We are pretty vocal. For example, turnover rate right now is on the increase. That's a problem. Our workforce will become a challenge, which means children and families are not going to be served. 10 years ago, we had to deal with that. Some of the solutions that we came up with were helpful, and others were not. So it's time to have those discussions. We meet with the deputy minister, we meet with the ministers, we meet with the assistant deputy ministers, depending on the particular issues. We also, you're right, we will point out to folks within the government when we see things that don't make sense or when we're not sure why one particular area is not working with the other area. Frankly, right now, I wonder why prevention's over in the other ministry and not with this ministry, because early intervention and prevention lead to less kids in care, but it's been moved that way. So does that answer your question? I mean, we are able to speak to multiple levels of folks within the government from Align's perspective, and our agencies, we encourage and support them, and they have chapters across the province, and they meet regionally with the people in the regions as well. And because we sit at practice and policy tables consistently, we are able to give feedback from the agency sector very quickly to those kinds of policy and practice areas and research. Sometimes we've come up with research that counters why we should be doing things, like OBSD, for example, at the time, or signs of safety. There's different kinds of research around it, and we'll bring it forward if we see it and it's not come forward from the ministry. So,
Patty, you get our last question.
Okay, so just some context, first of all. When I was 23, I was a counselor at a camp in Saddle Lake, Alberta, when the children from the Davis Inlet were brought for treatment in that setting. When I was 26 years old, Yes, and that was 22 years ago, if anybody's counting. I was the director of an open custody facility for young offenders, so 10 young men, all of them high-risk offenders, living in an apartment complex, independent living. So 2 very different experiences of group care. I have seen transformational change, not just second-order change, but transformational change happen with children who are described as impossible to manage in the sweat lodge and in other ceremony. So from that perspective, I'm looking at your research that you provided us, and I read it all. And I'm looking at the Whitaker article. I don't see any evidence of Indigenous scholarship that is going towards this international consortium of building evidence-based models for effective, replicable, and scalable group home care and or treatment care. And so what I'm asking is, I kind of landed on the same page Greg landed on about why choose it. And so to me, this is more like the criterion of how children that would be appropriate for treatment care. But I also are taking into consideration everything else we've heard about, you know, the redesign of foster care and cultural connection with children and having children living in families that understand historic trauma. This is new. I highly doubt any of that knowledge and like deep Indigenous scholarship is represented here. So before we scale up treatment group home care, without considering that foster care, kinship care is transforming and we're starting to have a better understanding of what historic trauma is, the needs of children, knowing the power of ceremony. I read this with some deep caution that non-Indigenous scholars are going to go ahead and they're going to do their research as they should, and they should look for best practice. That's the right thing to do, but I feel like there's just this whole body of knowledge that is barely, there's still universities across this country that don't believe there's an Indigenous science that could inform this practice significantly. So I see one page that's on, you know, Indigenous, you know, something that's got an active ingredient. But I think that if it was grounded in this knowledge that has been around. I mean, there's been Indigenous group home care owned by Indigenous people who understand the ceremony parts for decades, but it's not here. So can you speak to that a little bit?
I mean, you're correct in what you're saying, right? That this group, I don't see that representation there either. And so I don't have much to say in terms of that. What I can say is I do share the perspective. I mean, we work with an elder that is on our campus 2 evenings a week, right? That is working with our children, that we have sweat lodges once and twice a week on campus. Mm-hmm. This is an integral part of kind of the work we do. And we've done and we've seen transformational change. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I used Meyer's term because it comes from the literature, right? But the absence in that international is you're accurate.
So I would even say that we need to push this idea forward to say, how about Indigenous people designing the case plans? How about Indigenous people driving the entire design of the ecology, which I love that word that you're using, like this. We have to look at every living being in this system and what is the relationship of that child with that being kind of ecology, right? So I would love to see this stuff include Indigenous scholarship.
Yeah, me too.
Patty, there's one comment I wanted to make. We're not talking about increasing group care, residential care, any of that. So we're certainly not talking about we need more. We're saying what we need needs to change, but we are absolutely not saying we need more.
Okay, so I misunderstood that, this thing when, this table, when it said Alberta had 10% of the children in treatment, I thought that the argument was that there could be more. No? I misunderstood?
The argument is that we are at that threshold.
Oh, we're
so
there.
we don't need to go any further, right?
But
And so-
we need to shift practice to ensure there's not more.
And that kids
Yes.
get the treatment when they need the treatment, not after they've been through a multiple
Got it.
placements. And we need the contracts to reflect that good practice and the ability to get kids back home and use the elders and all that stuff that is not in there now. Even though most of those, certainly the higher end campus-based residential treatment, all have what you're talking about.
We haven't heard enough about reunification homes yet, and about how, what critical place a reunification home from an Indigenous perspective, run with an Indigenous way of knowing, what those could be doing as well, right?
Oh, for sure.
I mean, we've heard a little bit, but I don't think we've heard enough.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right, I'd like to thank very much the group from Align, Anton, Bruce, and Rhonda. So thank you, we really appreciated your presentation. It was extremely helpful to the panel, so thank you.
So we don't get a break, eh?
So the bad news is we've worked right through our break. However, the good news is if everybody's willing to go right to the next presentation and take a break at 3:30, then we'll only be 15 minutes behind for the rest of the afternoon. Or would you rather take the break right now and then skip the 3:30 break?
Just 5 minutes.
Okay, let's take a 5-minute break and then maybe skip the next one. Okay. All right, I think we're going to have to just, whoever's in here, please take their seats and we'll get started again. And hopefully everybody else will get the drift and join us. So we're very pleased at this point to have the Child Advocacy Centers join us. We have Bonnie Johnson, the Executive Director from the Sheldon Kennedy Child Advocate Center, and members from the Zebra Child Protection Center as well, and they're going to share their experiences with us. According to my information, we have about 25 minutes for the presentation, followed by 20 minutes of panel discussion. And of course, we are running late, so my usual warning, if we could keep questions and answers concise, that would be appreciated. So, go ahead.
Thank you. Myself and Kim are very pleased to be here this afternoon as an opportunity to talk to you about innovation practice that is working, and it's around integrated practice across systems. Child advocacy centers, just to give you a little bit of a precursor, there's probably about over 800 child advocacy centers in the States. They were formed in about 1985 to respond to child protection and police working differently together. In Canada, there's probably about 24 emerging right now, of which about 12 are operational. And we will be speaking to you from our experiences within Calgary and Edmonton, but under a provincial perspective as we work together. So as you're all aware, the impacts of child abuse are horrendous, and we are understanding more and more that if we don't prevent child abuse or help children really quickly that have been abused, they are going to enter into traumatic events in their adulthood, with children being 4 times more likely to be arrested as a juvenile and twice as likely to be arrested as an adult. And children who have been abused are 26 times more likely to experience homelessness. Children who have been abused are 30% less likely to graduate from high school. KPMG has done an estimate that this is costing this country the impacts probably over $22 billion a year, and Alberta about $2.4 billion a year on the impacts of kids that have been traumatized.
Can I just interrupt you? A quick question?
Sure.
How do you define abuse?
Abuse is our physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, right? It's basically the definition that you would be using, I'm sure, here in your proceedings. Yeah, nothing different.
So we know that historically child abuse investigations have been handled by individual agencies and organizations without the benefit of that collaborative approach. And we've seen that without the benefits of that collaborative value that the child advocacy centers can bring to these very complex investigations, that the children and youths of our province have experienced a number of outcomes.
And if I can just add, I come from a background with child protection and health. We had really good people doing really good work in the past, but it's one of the toughest pieces of work you'll ever do, and we weren't giving them the tools to do the work they needed to do. And as much as they tried, there were barriers, bureaucratic barriers that they kept bumping up against, and they couldn't work collaboratively. And that's where you see everybody would come out of a meeting and one's going this way and one's going that way because they couldn't share the information, and that's what we're trying to depict here.
So some of the outcomes that we've seen from working in silos are fragmented sharing of information, insufficient information to make those critical decisions in the best interest of the child in investigation, the re-traumatization of children, youth, and families. We've seen an increased wait time for support services, as well as lower conviction rates. So prior to the Zebra Center existing, we were sitting at seeing less than 20% from a conviction rate, and we're now averaging 70 to 75%. We've also previously seen an increased burnout rates amongst professionals, an ineffective use of resources, and a lack of community awareness and engagement.
We talk about to know better is to do better. And this brain science is emerging right across of understanding that child abuse is a form of trauma, and that if you have constant repetitive trauma, that's going to impact the development of the brain. But with the right intervention and the right supports, we can move our kids forward. So the next slide is a little bit of the aha moments that we're learning. If you look at understanding the brain science on the child, the impact on the child, it's got to change the way we practice, and it's got to change the way our interventions are affecting our kids. But to do that, you've got to have the systems working differently together. Social workers can't be making those changes out there. Police can't be. You have to have systems coming together and leadership across ministries supporting, almost in a sense, giving them permission to do their work differently. And each informs the other. So the better we get at that around changing systems and integrating systems with police, child and family health working together, the better impact we're going to have on our child. And with that, the better impact we keep improving our practice constantly. So from that, we've been operational, and there's a few of you that have come through our center. We've been operational about 4 years and 3 months in Calgary. We bring together over 115 professionals on the floor. We deal with, and I know you've already had some talks around the 85 and 15% that I know Bruce is an expert at with his research. Child advocacy centers deal with that 15%. We deal with those tough cases, pretty much all the child sexual abuse cases and the more severe cases of physical abuse and neglect. So we're dealing with this end of the continuum that requires a wraparound, integrated approach to move much more quickly. On our floor, and you'll see all of our partners, we have all the Calgary Police Child Abuse Unit are located on our floor. 2 RCMP officers are posted there to handle all of the outlying areas. We move right into southern Alberta. We've also got child and family services there. Pediatricians are on the floor. Therapists are there from Alberta Children's Hospital. The Crown will do their prep work there. So everything becomes almost a one-stop shop of moving in. And I'm really pleased to say we're moving forward with really good relations with First Nations with Treaty 7. We've just signed off a partnership agreement with Satina, and they are becoming extended team members at our center. Their police will be coming in to do their interviews. Child and family will be coming in to be able to benefit from some of the resources, expertise, triaging, and working very closely with Sixica. We've been working with Tyler as well. And the whole benefit here is we actually come together on neutral ground, working in the best interest of that child and learning from each other. So those are some of our partnerships we have on hand.
Much like the Sheldon Kennedy Center, we have very similar partnerships, though a slightly different model. So the Zebra Center, this is our 15th year. We opened our doors in 2002. And so we have the same concept from an integrated multidisciplinary team, both on-site and off-site. Some differences to point out, we do not have our medical staff on site. They work out of the Child and Adolescent Protection Center through the Stollery Hospital. And from an Alberta Health mental health standpoint, we do not have therapists currently on site, but otherwise we still have obviously our Zebra Center staff, the Edmonton Police Service, the entire child protection section works out of our office, as well as 2 RCMP members and Child and Family Services.
And we should mention too, before we go further, is that we are what I call a hybrid. So there is a not-for-profit backbone organization that works with all of these big 5 organizations. So Zebra has it and we have it. And we're the guys that keep that momentum going. We keep moving. If you moved everybody in the building, they'd say this is really convenient. But our job is to make sure we're changing practice. We're changing in outcomes. We're making sure we're pushing research, training, the most advanced leading practices. And so we lead that through influential, basically, leadership of working together, of coming to a consensus on how we're moving this agenda forward. So that's our job as the not-for-profit backbone organizations that are working with these 5 that are moving forward.
So when we talk about what is a child advocacy center, really at its core, it is a child-friendly facility in which law enforcement, child protection, prosecution, mental health, medical, and victim advocacy professionals are working together to investigate abuse and help children heal from abuse, and that offenders are held accountable. This really speaks to the core belief, and it's a very integral component of what child advocacy centers are. So how does a CAC work? So a child advocacy center, again, this speaks to the necessity for the teamwork and that unified multidisciplinary approach for the vital work that's done. So the underpinning for child advocacy centers have always been and continues to be what is in the best interest of that child and family.
You'll see that there's multiple entry points. We have a criteria of which children are coming through the center. As I said, that basically fits within that 15% piece of the more serious cases. And they can come in through the police referrals, they can come in through child and family or from health or emergency. But once they come through, every morning at our center, we have triage. And all the information is brought to that table. So police are sitting there, child and family health. It's basically just common sense. And I know there's a slide coming up. We're sharing the information as per the acts, as per the legislation. We're respectful of what we can share in the best interest of the child. Back not so long ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, we were scrambling for information at the front end. You've got a case coming in. You're trying to figure out what do police know, what a child and family got, trying to figure out from the physician, is this intentional harm or not? You've got other kids in the home. You're trying to make decisions about apprehension, charging, what are you doing? Now, all that information comes right every morning, and we're open 24/7, so cases are flowing through all the time, but there's an intentional triage every morning where all that information is brought together. So as soon as that child comes in, they are wrapped, it's a wraparound service with all of those organizations that are moving as quickly and as comprehensively as they possibly can around getting that information up front. And that becomes that wraparound service around the child and family. And they enter into, they're not sitting in a police station, they're not sitting in a crisis unit. These kids are walking in family into a child-focused environment where they feel safe and they don't feel like they've done something wrong, because all the services are designed to wrap around them at that point in time. So I really like this depiction because it really shows there's multiple entries, but they're coming through and everybody is coming around that child.
So both the Sheldon Kennedy Center and Zebra have been working on the development of both national and provincial standards for child advocacy centers. So these standards were adopted and adapted from the National Children's Alliance standards in the States. So in the US, they have over 800 child advocacy centers, and that's where the inspiration for the Zebra Center came from 15 years ago, when we looked to the States to see how we were better able to serve children and families when there's allegations of abuse. So what we've recognized in the last few years is that there needed to be a move as a province in a whole towards the standardization that could then help inform the definitions of the CACs, the work that was being done in CACs, and exactly who was accountable for which piece.
This is important work, and Canada now are doing, we'll just flip back. Canada is now pulling together, it'll be very similar with those standards, but it'll be Canada made. The Federal Department of Justice has done a very extensive literature review that really rationalizes all of those standards, and that yes, that's what we need to be meeting as well. And this is very important. People can't just put up a shingle and call themselves a child advocacy center. This has to be rigor around the integrity of the services and what we're doing. So we hold really fast to that in the development of those standards that have to be in place. I've mentioned the information sharing. We, at the Sheldon Kennedy Child Advocacy Center and also at Zebra, we have memorandums of understanding with all of our partner organizations. Ours was signed for a 3-year period. Last year it was renewed for another 5 years with the RCMP involved as well. And we look at what we can share. There are protocols, and of course the acts are all there, that nobody would ever compromise a case. very respectful of exactly of what can be shared, always working in the best interest of the child, and very excited again about the work of the First Nations, and we're continuing to sign MOUs on with our First Nations as well to help develop that capacity, that sharing, that training, having a go-to place to say, you know what, we're having trouble with this case. How do we maneuver? How do we get the resources? And how do we make sure our kids have all the services and rights and opportunities they deserve? And that's exactly the premise we work on. Over the, since we've been open, and if you're looking at just that 15%, we have handled over 6,000 assessments in a little over 4 years. We're handling over 124 new assessments a month that are coming through, right from birth right up to 18 years of age. And as Kim talked, there's standards, but those are what I call the sort of the field posts here. But every region and city can expand that program. So in our center, we do a lot of prevention, outreach awareness. We look at our practice. Both centers have victim support, victim advocates that are there to help kids navigate through. We work with First Nations and we work with diverse populations. And we also do a whole research component around understanding who these kids are. And that's been huge because there was an example where we were handling newborns from newborns to 3 months of age. And these little ones, there was a huge problem in our city about 5-6 years ago where these little guys were being seriously hurt. And the minister of the day, I remember the phone call, what are we going to do? And so we actually formed a team of public health nurses and police and Child and Family Services. And their job was to make sure they mitigated the risk so that in fact these babies could be safe. We had RBC come through and they were devastated that this could happen to little babies. How can we help? A police officer had been talking about how do we get to these high-risk pregnant women on the streets? We don't know what to do for them. So with a combination of RBC and ourselves, we put together a program, an outreach program to get to these high-risk women on the streets. If you get to them and provide them with the right prenatal care, you're going to help them, and these babies are going to be born safe. Hopefully they're not going to be compromised. The first month we had 30 referrals. At the end of the year, we had over 300 coming in. So we made the call to Alberta Health, who was very, very receptive, and we put together a proposal. But this is where the data comes in. If we'd all been working separately, we wouldn't have had the data. We wouldn't have understood the issues. We wouldn't have understood the gaps. We could put everything together and out of that program receive some assistance from Alberta Health to actually create an outreach program. But without the data, without everybody working together, I can tell you right now, that police officer would still be on the front line trying to figure out what do we do with this high-risk pregnant woman. So that's the power of the center and the data, the integrated practice that is now telling us that over half of our kids coming in are suffering severe mental health issues. So we're able now, as Sheldon would say, I'll use his quote, we're making the invisible visible. And we can only do that by working together and integrating our services and understanding the issues and the gaps. So we know we're dealing with over 124 new assessments a month, right from birth, right to up to age 18. We know the gender of our kids. We know the types of abuse that are coming in. And the second, over 97% of our kids know who hurt them. And so for them to have the courage to tell their story, and this is where it happens in these child advocacy centers, this is where the interview is done. This is where the medical exam is done. To tell their story takes a lot of courage as we all wrap around to make sure that child is going to feel safe. And the alarming part is that from the youth from 12 to 17, over 63% are dealing with suicidal thoughts, substance abuse, self-harm, mental health issues. It's one thing to be in a children's hospital and you think, oh my goodness, these poor little souls, because you can see what's going on. A child that's been abused, you can't see the damage often that's happened. We're now through brain science and our stats and working together, we know where we need to intervene. We know what we need to do differently. And the game changer, as Kim goes into her stats, has been the community engagement on child advocacy centers. Our board is made up of community, corporate people. It's made up of the providers. This is a community issue. It's not just social services. It's not just police. This is how do we all understand how we protect our children as a community, and that's what it represents. As Kim's going to talk about her hours, we're just starting and we've already had over 2,500 hours of volunteer time coming in to our center. And that includes the 4-foot with tails, the little dogs that we do whatever it takes that come in to volunteer.
There's certainly a lot of similarities from a stats perspective between the two centers, the two main centers or hubs, as you will, in the province. At Zebra in Edmonton here, so the vast majority of what we deal with is child sexual abuse. We'll, again, still on that 15% spectrum, we'll deal with an additional 10% that speaks to the extreme physical abuse. And then we're starting to really see an increase in assisting where there's witnesses of extreme violence, so witnesses to domestic violence, witnesses to homicide. We certainly, again, through that trust and engagement within the community, through policing organizations, as we've expanded our relationship with our CMP, we're seeing more and more referrals come in for more and more, just to show those increase in that area. So each year, since we've been open for the last 15, we've seen a continual increase in the number of files that we investigate and the children and families that we support. We don't believe that it necessarily means that there's more child abuse is occurring, but rather that there's an increased priority in reporting within the community. So the increase in demand is a testament to the need for growth. We have to continue growing in both resources, in funding, partnerships, and programs. Like Bonnie had mentioned, it's a huge undertaking for us. It's a huge amount of support that needs to be provided. At Zebra, last year alone, we did over 698 forensic interviews. We supported more than 1,500 kids, and our volunteers donated close to 4,000 hours. From there, we've seen a number of emerging impacts. So we've seen that there's a greater understanding of the impact on brain development, as Bonnie had mentioned, really being able to integrate the science behind the child advocacy centers has, I think, propelled us forward and given a stronger voice. There's been improved timelines in the coordinated assessment and investigation of child abuse cases. For files that are referred to the center, they're coming in for a forensic interview within 7 days. There's a reduction in the number of interviews that children are required to do when we look at really trying to minimize the trauma of what these children and youth are going through and really wanting to get the best evidence. Having that forensic interview and talking to the child once has been a huge win for child advocacy centers, and improved collaboration and working relationships amongst partners in the center, without a doubt.
There's also the opportunity when you're located in a one floor, one building, is that when we talk about increased access to support and therapeutic resources, our police officers can be doing an interview and perhaps they're dealing with a developmentally challenged child. They walk down the hallway, or they've got those relationships and they're going, could you help me with this? I'm not too sure how best to get to this child or how best to answer. So we're able to, by working together, we can be more creative. And the other thing, by working together, our wait list now for therapy with the Alberta Children's Hospital Child Abuse Team has gone from 8 months to 3 months now. And that's through better efficiencies by working together more effectively together. And you'll see at the bottom, KPMG has been working with us, and we did a social return on investment around, this is business, as much as it is better outcomes for kids. It's also about how you use your money in the best way possible. And in one unit alone, KPMG estimated close to just under $600,000 additional value by working more effectively together. It's, boils down to common sense, right? If you're using your resources better, you're not running all over the place, you're not waiting on that phone for 2 weeks on those cold calls. Is that police officer getting back to me? When are we going to meet? How do we start to move this together? You're working that way. There's greater information sharing, absolutely. Like, where do you get started if you don't have all the information in front of you? And these cases, these are challenging cases. These are the toughest of the toughest cases coming through the region. These are cases of torture. These are cases of little ones being sexually abused, walking down the hallway. We see them every day, getting their examinations. And so time is of the essence on these kids. We need to move in as quickly as we possibly can to intervene, to support, so that these kids can move forward. I saw the other day, we have now Webster. He's this beautiful trauma dog, and Zebra has had their trauma dogs for a while. And this little girl, there she is with her little ponytail, and she was going back for a medical exam saying, come on, Webster, let's go. And off he went, and up he got on the examining table. I don't know, Dr. Swan, if that was super healthy, but it was very therapeutic. And there she was safe. She was absolutely safe. And because of our child life specialist who does all the prep work now, those exams are done in half the time. because it's minimized the trauma and the stress for those kids and for those parents that are having to go through this as well. Greater trust and shared accountability, and that to me is the big one, is the shared accountability. In days, and I know I lived it, a bad case happens, people are going, thank God it's not us. Thank God that didn't happen in our region. Too bad for them. Boy, the police were okay, we're over here. Child and family probably screwed up over here. And that's the way it went, because it was a culture of fear. Now what you've got is a shared accountability. It's remarkable. It's absolutely incredible. Everybody is at that table. They are there to support each other. They've got each other's backs, and they're working on behalf of that child. We had a child come in from Drumheller area. The abuse had been done in Calgary. The family moved to Drumheller. In an afternoon, that whole team mobilized. The physician was there. We had 2 rounds of dogs in. We had the child life specialist. We had the detectives in. We had everybody wrapping around that family. And when that little girl walked out, after she'd seen the police officer, she looked up and she said, I told my story today. That would have never happened if those organizations had not been working together the way they were. Territory's been parked, ego's been parked, and we work together. And I can't say enough about the organizations, that they've come together at that table. And I chair, every month I chair, how are we going to move agendas in terms of practice and research and training? And I've never once heard one of those organizations say we can't do it. They've said, okay, we've got to figure this out, we've got to do that. And we've had, and I'm going to kudos to the Ministry of Human Services and Children's Services, been behind this provincially, as has Justice, to figure out how we support moving forward in different ways. And that's the biggest thing, has been the community engagement, that this is a community issue, and the shared accountability, and giving professionals the tools they need to do the work they need to do. You know, you go back in our center and we work with hope and help and healing, and we work with vibrancy. We don't work with doom and gloom. Professionals have worked for years to be able to work in a system like this, that they don't have to spend 80% of their time dealing with barriers and bureaucracy, and they can spend 80% of their time dealing with children. And that's what's changed here. And there is an atmosphere of support and a culture of well-being, because they know they're making a difference on any given day. That's the difference of organizations coming together. And positioning the integrated practice across and within ministry frameworks. We were meeting yesterday with 4 ministries of how this is going to look provincially, and how ministries will be working together around integrated practice, right from training, you name it, right across that has to happen. And raising the profile of child abuse in the community, my goodness. I often tell the story about, we've got Calgary Stampedes coming up. We've had bullbusters, we've had cowboys. They're talking about child abuse. They're wearing the label on their Stetsons. This would have never happened before if this was not opened up to the community to take responsibility. Everything was kept close. This is a community issue. And you'll have the Cody Snyder who'll be narrating for the CBC. He's talking about child abuse. And he's bringing it out into the community. And that's been the big difference as well. And the First Nations, I cannot say enough about that. I just really see hope here around being able to circle around and work with each other with an equity and a respect that puts the child in the middle, and making sure we're sharing our resources and our wisdom that work together to move the agenda forward as well. So those are some of our emerging. My goodness, we could talk for 2 days with you with child advocacy centers. We get a little excited. The provincial model has been talked about for about the last 2.5 years. We went up to Edmonton and we met with the Ministry of Human Services at that time and said, you know, all children in Alberta deserve the same rights and access to these specialized services, not just because you're sitting in Calgary or because you're sitting in Edmonton. If you happen to be in First Nations, if you happen to be in Milk River, that child still deserves that same opportunity and right. And again, I was really, really grateful to the ministry who brought together the 4 with education, health, justice, and human services at the time, and senior leadership that sat down at the table and said, how do we do this? And I know what a privilege that is, to be able to work at a table and look at practice and try to influence it together with the government. And in very short order, we brought about a model for a provincial model of integrated practice, with now looking at 2 hubs in Calgary and Edmonton, because we have a bigger population and more specialized services with the Stollery and the Alberta Children's Hospital. Hospital. And there are now emerging child advocacy centers in Lethbridge, Medicine Hat, Red Deer, Lloydminster, Fort McMurray, and Grand Prairie has been operating as a center for a few years as well. And working together as a network across this province, providing support, looking at our data, looking at our research, looking at leading practice, training. We always involve, if it's international, we're working with Lethbridge, we're working with First Nations, or coming into our training sessions. So how do we create that whole network to inform and move forward on this 15%? So again, a meeting yesterday and now conversations to say, how do we continue to move this forward? And as our very last, we really believe that child advocacy centers have a critical role within the child intervention service delivery continuum, and they have that critical role in that 15%. Because we can literally wrap around and do in hours and days that was taking weeks and months to do. So that's where we see this. I believe it's transformational. The more that you have that wrap around your experts on those tough cases, it's opening up capacity of that other 80-85% in the community to be much more proactive and much more supportive with those neglect cases to help those families. We all know that when you get a bad case, that system falls down. It falls to its knees. It paralyzes the system. And I can almost guarantee you get a bad case, the next day your apprehensions are going up. People are moving in this way. These centers are focusing and specializing on that tough work to allow that increased capacity at the community level to be much more preventive and much more in terms of the early intervention. The other piece that I've mentioned there, it's reducing what I call or minimizing system-induced trauma. We are creating trauma and re-victimizing these kids when they have to go from system to system to system to navigate. And that's part of that whole brain science piece as well. From the individual to the practice to the system piece has all got to be interconnected to reduce that re-traumatization. And our frontline staff, they got a tough job. It's one of the toughest jobs out there. You're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. You're keeping that child in, you shouldn't have kept the child in. You take the child out, it's a tough job. And I worked at Alberta Children's Hospital, I worked that floor as a director. I thought that was tough until I went over into Child and Family Services. And those workers aren't valued enough for the tough decisions they have to do every day. And we need to give them the tools, we need to give them the support, we need to be able to wrap around them for the tough work they do on any given day. And systems, you can do that by these systems coming together, and we've seen that in our center. Our center, people go through and people go, people are actually happy here. And we go, well, yes, this is because we can support, and we know we've all been there. We know when we can reach out and support who's having a tough day. And you're wrapping around your staff as well. And we've got people now that don't want to leave. They don't want to leave the practice, which is phenomenal. Because every day it's about doing better. And every day it's about figuring out, well, this worked and this could have worked differently, but how do we make this better? And we do that across 5 systems. I did a strategic plan back a few weeks ago, and we were working on it. And we brought it to the table, and within a few hours I had 5 organizations agreeing on a strategic plan for the year. Like, that's magic. That's good stuff when you're working in that same direction with a common vision. So we feel very strongly about this, and we really hope that you will consider this in your recommendations of where child advocacy centers fit in this province and within the child intervention system. And Kim and I really thank you for your time, and we really appreciate that. It was quite an honor to be able to come to talk to you today about the work of the centers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I do have a list of questions. However, I'm going to ask the first one. More about a comment than a question. Exactly. Chair's prerogative. I think you do absolutely fabulous work. I've always been so impressed, and I haven't had the opportunity to visit yet, but I'm looking forward to actually coming and visiting your centers.
Good.
I guess I'm a little bit concerned, though, about Northern Alberta and how it fits in this centralized provincial model where we've got everything in Edmonton and Calgary. Yes, in Northern Alberta, we only have 10% of the population, but we have proportionally much higher rates of family violence, of child abuse, of historical, multi-generational child abuse that goes on. So we've got extremely high needs in those areas. And we do have the Caribou Centre in Grand Prairie that has been working very effectively, doing exactly the same kind of wraparound services that you're doing in both Zebra and Sheldon Kennedy. And yet I feel like they're kind of being lost in the shuffle somehow of centralizing the services. And I'm concerned about the rights of access for kids in Northern Alberta. So when you got a kid from High Level or Fox Lake, they could get to Grand Prairie far more easily than they can on a, 8, 10, 12 hour, even a flight to get to Edmonton or, Calgary. So I would love to see a model that more strongly incorporated or recognized the unique challenges we have in Northern Alberta, not just being rural, but being remote as well, and kind of making them a stronger part of that partnership. So I'd love your perspective on that.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. I mean, I started off my career in Wabasca as a nurse, just outside of Slave Lake. So I really appreciate what you're talking about in distances, and we had to get our kids into Edmonton and all of that in the days of the Charles Capsule Hospital a long time ago. I should have also mentioned, this is developmental, so we're in that process of trying to figure out what we can do and what's going to best meet the needs. And Caribou has been with us at the table through all the ministry conversations and the integrated model and what we're doing. And what I should have mentioned is that we're also creating outreach services. So you could be in Calgary and create a center with 300 people, but that's not going to you got a big hub, you got a big mecca there, but that's not going to help the capacity sitting out in First Nations or, like I said, Milk River in Southern Alberta. So we really have an outreach component where our forensic people will go out to the communities, they will go out to First Nations, and more we're trying to figure out with our pediatricians how they can be more accessible. How do you actually use technology, right, to be able to get some of these expertise from these pediatricians with child abuse, because there are not a lot of them in this province. So it's going to be that combination of dialogue, what needs to work, where do certain services need to be best situated, how can we look at outreach. We're not just going to be sitting there in our centers, we're moving out, we're moving our expertise and capacity out into places as well. And again, where do you use technology where you have to? So it will be an evolving conversation to figure out what needs to go where, what works, what doesn't. But we totally appreciate what you're saying. You're going in from Grand Prairie to high level, that's a big distance, right? You're going into First Nations, many of them, I remember working with kids that had never, it was frightening to go to Edmonton. How do you bring them out? It was just, whoa, totally foreign. So we're gonna have to take a look at how we do that, be more resourceful, be more creative to move out. Not just sitting in a center, but moving out.
I appreciate that, and I would strongly suggest that whenever they're developing that model, that they consider that there should be a hub in the north that is accessible simply because of the challenges that we face.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and that was mentioned actually yesterday. That was brought up as now trying to figure out what's working, what isn't working, what do we need to make sure we take a look at for sure. Yeah.
Thank you. Moving on to Graham.
Thank you, Chair, and I'm sure everyone here will echo the kudos that the Chair outlined here as well too. And you spoke about intervention and when a child comes to you after an abuse has occurred, and I wanted to ask about the supports that are provided long-term wise. So mental supports, potentially a year from when this has occurred, or even 2 years from when this has occurred, because I'm sure with a traumatic experience like this, it's a long-term rebuilding situation. And then also the care that's provided during whatever procedural thing will happen. So the child transitioning into care and being in care outside of the parents, or even during prosecution, what kind of supports are provided for that child? And if there's opportunity for improvement.
I'll start with your last question, and then we'll each have a little different in terms of the supports. But the beauty of this is when you talk about what happens to a child that's in care, is that we don't duplicate anything the 5 organizations do. So we work with these big systems. So Child and Family Services, if a child is having to go into care or supervised visit or foster care, they're coming in for their investigation, but then Child and Family is handling all of that, right? So they're moving it through their system. So this becomes seamless for them. The investigations are done at the center, and then they're moving out to what that child requires at that point in time for their ongoing care, right, through Child and Family Services. And the other one you had on that was the justice system. Again, our crowns will come to the center. They are doing their interviews there. They are getting their information. They are preparing kids and family to go into court. We're just working. We had a meeting 2 weeks ago with the provincial court in Calgary. We are now trying to bring in closed circuit TV into the center so that kids can actually can testify there. We had 3 justices at the table. We had the Crown. We'll be working with the defense, and we had the court there to figure out exactly how we can do this. So we wrap around. We want to continue as these kids move into the justice system that they're receiving all that wraparound support. And if we can move it through the center, it's a place they're familiar with. It's child focused. right? They're getting all of those supports to be able to move through to testify for the court piece. So we're working very hard with the justice system on how we can make that a better process to wrap around them as well.
And then we're an additional layer of support throughout that entire continuum. So right from disclosure through investigation and that judicial process. So we're a very specialized victim services program is available through what we call our child support services program. So that's providing that additional layer of support for the kids and their non-offending caregivers as they navigate that. So we're that central hub that's able to, they can call us and they can ask for an update on their case. They can call us and say things aren't going well at school. What are some resources we have? So we become that safe, neutral place that they can come back to when they need support throughout the entirety of that process.
We're the same. We have a victim support unit on the floor. We never close a case. So a police may close a case, but a family can come back to us in 6 months, a year, 2 years, if they still require that kind of help. Therapy, we give through the Children's Hospital, the therapist, for as long as kids require it. They will receive the therapy that they require for as long as they need it. But again, we're there. We're not going anyplace. So we help through the victim support, exactly, families navigate through all of those systems. And the other beauty is we have community helping through donations, that we may have to help a family with essential needs, or they may need back to school clothes, or they may need this or that. That's all provided through the center for these families as well. And yours is the same, I'm pretty sure, yeah. And then my other piece is the center, but then we work with all the community agencies. So you've got this, but then we work with all the agencies in the city to make those referrals to where people will get the ongoing help they require as well. So it doesn't just shut down with us, we continue to move out.
Tyler.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you both for the presentation. And my question is to Bonnie. I've been to the center, and obviously I'm so impressed with the center and what it has to offer. And you certainly, to me, when you go in there, you get a very positive sense when you go in there, and you get to see what's happening. And I support what's happening there. You know, you've outlined your integrated practice, and you know, obviously you're dealing with some very complex issues, privacy, on reserve now, you know, and you know, when I sit and talk with Sheldon, he puts it very simple, you know, we're just connecting the dots.
Yeah,
you know,
we're connecting the dots.
He's always telling me that, well, we're connecting the dots, and then, you know, he'll show me his strategic plan, and, you know, I'm expecting this, you know, 100-page document. It's in a one-page form here, right? So maybe you can just kind of explain, if you can, how you connect those dots. You know, you mentioned MOUs, you know, and now you're, again, sort of working with First Nations, which are federal. I know we have an affiliation, too, in the Jordan's Principle with 6, 7, and 8, you know, so there's a lot of emerging things there. But I just sort of wanted you to sort of elaborate on that and try to articulate that as best you can. You know, because Sheldon puts it very simple, and you know, he says, "Okay, well, Bonnie, you explain it." That's kind of what he does there. So that's my question, Chair.
As in, how do we actually do integrated practice? What does that look like? You know, we came to the table, just a little bit of a quick history, and everything we do, we take the very complex, and it's true, our business plan's a page. It's one page, because otherwise people don't read it, and we have to take it down to simplicity. There was a desire. Sheldon came in 7 years ago. He talked to the chief of police. He'd been down in Denver. He said, could we do something here? We were coming off of a very bad case at that time. We walked into the room, and we all knew we could do better. We had to do better. The systems had to do better. And so, as I said, everything was parked at the door, the territory, the ego, everything. We were focusing on children. And, you know, we've been incredibly lucky, Tyler. Everybody has come. The vision is pretty simple. It's not complicated. Every day, like I said, we try to do better. And the vision is always working in the best interest of the child. So we came in, and if I look at the whole experience, because I was there from the very beginning, was that, again, we just knew systems had to work more effectively together. And by not doing it, we were getting in the way of best practice. And we started off with our MOUs. And I remember the day we had 6 lawyers in the room. And they were all, nope, can't watch that, can't do that. And we finally turned around to them and we said, we appreciate that. You need to tell us how we can do this. You need to tell us how we can move forward, and it changed the conversation. And it changed the culture of moving forward. And we moved in and we signed off the MOUs that was coming in to share of a collaborative practice and again, how we could work with children. From there, we developed a strategic plan. We have 5 strategic directions. That was all done with the organizations. Everything is done in consensus, transparency, respect, integrity at the table. We have great conversations at the table and we keep moving forward all the time. We don't get stuck, or I have never heard the word "I can't do it." We're going to figure this out of how we can move through these. So I think we've been incredibly gifted. We have a community board, just as Zebra does, of incredible business corporate people, where the heads of our organizations also sit as well. And it's constantly looking at efficiencies, effectiveness, and I watch community where they pick up a phone to their colleagues and they can make a decision, which, no disrespect, would take government 6 years to make a change. And that's what we can bring, is we bring the nimbleness. We bring that ability from a business sense to move quickly and to work with the systems and organizations to free them up to get the work done that they need to do. So we come together in a spirit of camaraderie, and we have tough conversations. We have good conversations, but it's always about how you're going to get better every day. And it's challenging and it's good, and it's what I call really creative tension that keeps moving the agenda constantly. And then we'll get an idea and we'll go, well, why can't we do that? Or somebody said, we've done that for 10 years, and we'll go, so? Like, is it really working? And so you're constantly challenging that and building on all of that effectiveness. And we've had wonderful leaders. And I think I heard that from the last conversation. We've had wonderful leaders, and it moves right down from we always worked from our leadership to our mid-management through a front line. And it's engaging all 3 levels constantly of moving forward and creating a culture and an engagement. And I think it's a freedom and a permission to people to think and work differently for what they were trained to do to get the job done. So I don't know if that, we've been blessed, and I can't say enough about the organizations, the Calgary Police, the RCMP, Marianne Ryan, when she was commanding officer here, she moved heaven and earth to get those officers in, just as she's done in Zebra and she did in Grand Prairie. It's been incredible leadership, absolutely the advocacy of Sheldon Kennedy, without a doubt, right, in terms of the awareness of the issue. And just can-do people at all levels that we're moving this as a community. And sure, you have your bumps and you learn and your lumps and you figure it out and you keep moving forward. But we've always, it's kept moving forward for sure.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you both for being here. You're doing amazing things. So I love what you said. I love what you're doing. So I guess now we're going to push you to do more, I guess. So what we heard yesterday, when we had the chiefs and the representatives come in from, as our chair said, some of the remote parts of Alberta, we need to find a way to deliver what you're delivering in Calgary and Edmonton on the Métis settlements, on the reserves, on the remote parts of Alberta. So I guess in this scenario, I guess I look at you right now as the experts and the trainers of the trainers. Are you going to be able to train, because the other thing they said is, yeah, it's all fine and good, they're happy to come into Edmonton and see us, but they said, when are you going to come out and see us on the reserve and at the Métis settlements? And I think that's a fair comment. So are we, when, how, what, and what recommendations should our committee be making so that we can do the amazing things you're doing now in Calgary and Edmonton on fill in the blank Métis settlement, First Nations reserve?
I can start. Sure. It's certainly been part of the conversations that we've been having for a while, and especially with the provincial model of integrated practice, there's been a lot of discussion around the balance between really enhancing and developing that expertise within those 2 hubs, so to speak, and how much knowledge you are training some of those satellite or those spoke, so to speak, locations. And when you look at things like forensic interviewing as an example, that's a very perishable skill. So if that's not something that's being used all the time, then is that really going to be of the most value or benefit for that community? And what we've experienced at Zebra personally is that there certainly have been times where we've had to mobilize and go up. There was a case 2.5 years ago or so, where we ended up sending an RCMP member, one of our forensic interviewers, up on reserve to do 6 interviews because that's what was in the best interest of that community in that investigation. So it's something that we're very aware of, something that has certainly been part of our conversations, and I think at this point we're just trying to figure out that balance from where that capacity and those resources are best used.
You make a really good point. Like, to show respect, you need to go out. You need to go to First Nations, you need to be in the communities, you need to understand what the issues are to show that respect, for sure. And that takes time, and you need to develop the relationships with the elders, the chiefs, the front end as well. And as Kim was saying, there's a fine balance. You can do the forensic training, but if you only get a couple, and I hate to say even 2 are too many, but if you get 2 bad cases a year, you're not necessarily using those skills. So what's the right balance? I think if I'm being really honest, we need more capacity in our centers to be able to move out, right? To be able to help. I work with a core team of 10 in the not-for-profit end of trying to do all this work with everybody else. So I think it's going to be that balance between where do you need to be, where's your critical points that you need to be, and then how do you have extra capacity out of these centers to help with that. We've actually moved our training into Lethbridge. We've actually moved our training out as well to go out to do the outreach piece. But you're right, the more this grows, it'll probably be a conversation around capacity and perhaps additional resources. But it's a good return on investment. You know, if you're focused in the right direction, right?
Well, outside of the human damage, which we all need to think about, courts are expensive, healthcare is expensive, the justice system's expensive, policing is expensive. But still, the core point of all that is to get to the human damage and to solve it.
Exactly. When you look at the impact in Alberta, an estimated $2.4 billion just on the impact, right, coming from trauma. Of lost jobs, lost lives, mental health issues, etc.
Well, I would just invite you, if you get further inspiration on what we should be doing today, tomorrow, or 3 weeks from now, please send it to us.
For sure, we will. And I know we've been working with Tyler around the Health Consortium for Treaty 6, 7, and 8, right, Tyler, that this model can be applied to many different issues that are happening. And again, it is around those organizations coming together. And so even on First Nations, they need to be looking at how their health is working with their child and family, is working with their police as well. So it's about a practice issue at the end of the day of how people are working together. So even on First Nations, they're not working together all the time. And so you got to start at some of this core piece around how are we going to work more effectively together, and then what resources do we need to move in to really advance that learning and development. Bruce.
Thank you both for the presentation, and wonderful to hear about the work you're doing in both locations. In a perfect world, a good outcome for kids that have been abused or severely neglected and with the population you serve would be that it never happens again. It's a one-off, that there's never a chance it would ever happen again. That's a very crude way of measuring one outcome. Are there other outcomes that you're looking at, and can you talk a little bit about how you're measuring success for children and families that have gone through your families or through your programs, and where you also might see that going?
Well, I can actually send you a whole document, Bruce, really soon, because I was just with KPMG this morning, and we do a lot of work with them, and we're now developed all of our key performance indicators. So that in fact we can know out of our strategic plan that we've received or reached success in these different areas, right? So everything from the satisfaction rates to, you'd love this as a university person, so I should get you involved in looking at all of this. But we've got a whole package that's come in, and I'm just reviewing with them right now. And I think that's what you're getting to, is that there's the outcome for kids, but it's also our other measurements that we're moving through, right? In terms of that, yeah. So we are definitely working on that. I've just yet to see it. It's hot off the press. We've been working on it, and it will be aligned with our strategic plan, with what we're trying to achieve, so that in fact we know if we're getting there, and then what we need to do differently in terms of interventions. The other big thing that's come through, and it was a lot through Sheldon's doing, working in Calgary with the Matheson Centre and the Hotchkiss Brain Institute, and through the University of Calgary and Children's Hospital, there's a major brain research, brain imaging that will be going on to actually understand these children in terms of the trauma, and then also looking at measuring effective interventions, if in fact they're working or not. So those are big picture ones, and then we have our key performance indicators that we're working through as well that have just been all scoped out here over this last week. I'm happy to share them with you. Yeah. Kim?
I've got Nicole and then Greg.
Thank you for your presentation. I know I can say firsthand how much, when I was a caseworker, how I appreciated the wraparound supports for the family and for myself as a frontline worker when we had those really difficult cases. So thank you. You guys talked about the great work that's happening with the Indigenous communities. So I'm wondering what kind of services that you guys are providing for Indigenous children, sort of the cultural connectedness and sort of what kind of engagement you're doing with Indigenous children and healing.
I think it would be very honest to say that the Zebra Center hasn't been our focus as much as we had hoped it would be, but we've certainly spent the last few years really trying to there's been a lot of movement in our cultural attunement program. So at this point, there is nothing specific. We're still working on the developing of the partnerships and those relations. We've certainly identified it as a key area of focus moving forward. We're in a bit of a flux with transition, so we're very encouraged that that'll remain a focus moving forward. But at this point, we're still kind of at that relationship and partnership building.
We have, what we have done is really try to create those relationships with Treaty 7, with the 5 First Nations in Treaty 7, and we're of the mind that we need to empower delegated First Nations to look after they can look after their children. So we're learning from the DFNAs. So whatever they want to bring into the center, whatever we need to go, we're learning from them. So it's not like we're doing this. These are their children. And we need to look at how we respect and support what works best in the First Nations. So if we go out to Tsuut'ina, if we go out to Siksika, we're learning what is important in Siksika. We're learning what is important out at Tsuut'ina around their culture and ways. And we work with their delegated First Nations, we work with their police. We get to work with Tyler who help educate us, and we're there as a support, a safety net in many ways, and they're doing the rest, and they're teaching us. It's not the other way around. They're teaching us what makes sense and what's respectful and what we need to do better.
Wow, thank you. At first I needed to think hard and contrive a question so I could have the floor, mostly just to praise the work that you both do in the Zebra Center and the Sheldon Kennedy Child Advocacy Center. It is it's mind-blowing just how inspirational your work is. But the answer to your last question, I think, is a perfect example of that. My observation of the reason you're so successful is your openness to new ways of doing things and new ways of learning, and to break down hierarchy and to break down barriers and to focus on what's really important, to wrap services around the individual and the needs of the individual, not around the needs of the institution. And I think I see a lot of that in government generally, not just government. Certain private sector, any large organization, the process tends to become the point. We lose sight of the outcome. The process, we check the box, mission accomplished, right? What I love about your work and your model is that it is the opposite of that. It's what do we need to do? Let's bring the right people together and let's do that thing. So you may or may not be able to answer the question I came up with, but
Sounds like a tough one that's coming.
well, I mean, maybe it's easier than I think, but are there other areas in your interaction as we talk about the work of this panel in child intervention, child and family services, the overall child welfare system as a whole? Are there areas specifically where you feel your model could work?
This model can work anywhere. Right? This model can work in the mental health, and I can see David Swan back there. We've talked about it. Tyler and David came through the center. This can work there. This is about integrated practice. This is about looking at an issue. You can't do this everywhere, but you look at where you want to leverage those hard things, those hard issues, and you bring the people in a room and you collectively look at what you're going to do differently and what barriers you need to knock down. It's pretty simple. What's working good? Where are the gaps here, and what do we need to do better? And you don't need to have meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting. It becomes paralysis. You start to say, this is where we need to move, and let's get on with it, and let's learn as we go. I know, like it's not rocket science here, right? It's common sense. The city of Calgary came in on some kind of water management thing, and they said we should be looking at this kind of approach. So I think it's really, you want to leverage, because collaboration, resources go in, that can be intensive, all those kinds of pieces, but you choose where you think you're going to have the best leverage and where that point's going to be. And this is around people working together in it's a collective impact model at the end of the day where you're going to leverage. So in answer to your question, even the City of Calgary, I think it was water management to mental health issues, to the First Nations Health Consortium, we've had some conversations as well when you bring all these complexities in people. And the other thing I think is that keep the vision simple. Like, who remembers a page of something? Like, every day we walk in and we're going to do better for our kids. Like, there has to be a common vision that people can wrap around and get passionate and excited about and understand to keep moving the agenda forward. And then I tell you, it works because the people are engaged to make it work. I don't know if that answers your question, but...
It does. Thank you. Excellent.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, you still had, okay, go ahead, Peter.
So as Bonnie knows, I've had the pleasure is the wrong word, isn't it?
It's pleasurable.
Yeah, I have actually worked on cases with the Sheldon Kennedy Center, but and thus I would attest that everything you've said is true.
Thank you.
I guess I want to come back to the purpose of this this panel and ask you, are there legislative processes, legislative integrations, legislative language that needs to change to enhance what you're doing?
You know, that's a super good question. Part of what we've been concentrating on right now, I mean, the sharing of information under the Children's Act was absolutely critical, without a doubt. That has, and we're one of the only provinces, I think now Manitoba is coming in behind as well, and maybe Saskatchewan will be doing the same thing, but that was critical of understanding what you can share. And remember that people, again, it's respecting the professionals doing the work. A bad case happens and people become absolutely paranoid and fearful, and you create cultures of fear where people can't do the best work they possibly can. So we're now having to work with people to help them understand that they can share information, because it went back so far the other way, that in fact they can do this. So that was really pivotal, and I think we'd have to work with the ministry in terms of there's other changes there. What we've been concentrating on, and I think I know this is the only province in Canada that's doing it right now, is trying to work with our ministries, and they have been really supportive, to say, where does this practice fit within your provincial ministry practice frameworks, right? So it's not just you guys are doing nice work out there. The CACs are doing work that is supported under the legislation of this province, and hopefully doing it in an effective, supportive, integrated way. So more and more what we want the conversation to be, and I think, Peter, that's what we'll get to the question of where are the gaps in legislation in terms of what we could do differently or better, is that the CACs need to be positioned within those provincial ministry frameworks of practice, because this is under that continuum service delivery care. And then I think from there, that will evolve in terms of the gaps and what's missing and what do we need to have more of. But I think that would be, I know I've certainly felt quite passionate about how we move that into that conversation at the ministry levels within frameworks. And then I think we can work from there. But the information sharing has been absolutely critical. That everywhere you go, if you ask your frontline providers, they'll talk to you about information sharing, what they can and cannot do.
So is that still a barrier? I'm going way back to one of our first or second meeting, and there was conversation about barriers around access to information, particularly with Alberta Health Services. Is that still a hurdle?
There's still barriers. There's absolutely still barriers, and I think it's sometimes it can be a little bit of a control issue. Nope, can't share that. Nope, can't have you see that. And I think maybe some of it is a little bit of, sometimes there's a little bit of a control thing there. I think lots of times people don't know what they can share and they can't share. And I think they're afraid if they step out of that they may be going in a place they shouldn't go. So I think there needs to be way more education and training around, in fact, what people can share collaboratively, again, in the best interest of the child. And I think I would be on a really positive strength base to say I think we need to look at education training and empowering our front line to be able to do some of their work and share.
In all honesty, I echo everything that Bonnie had said in regards to that. It's very encouraging that it's now becoming part of the conversation, and that it's moving forward in that direction.
I think that brings us to the end of our questions. I haven't missed anybody else. Thank you so much, Bonnie and Kimberly. We really appreciated that. And thank you again for the fabulous work that you do. And you've really helped the panel a lot in the direction that we want to take.
Thank you. I'd like to really again thank all of you, and I'd like to thank the ministries and government. I think Alberta is poised in a really unique position to push this as a leading model in this country. There's no doubt about it. And there's a lot of opportunity in your questions. There's still a lot of evolving work, but you know what? We're going to get there with the right types of supports to move it forward. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, I am calling the committee back to order, please, so that we don't end up super late again. I'd really appreciate any members who are in the room to please take their seats. And we are going to be hearing now from Métis Child and Family Services, Don Langford, the Executive Director, and he'll be doing a presentation for us. And according to the information I have, the presentation will be about 15 minutes, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for discussion. So we'll hopefully make that work, and really glad to have you here, Dan. So take it away.
Thank you.
Just press the, there you go.
Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to make a presentation today. I have a couple of slide presentations. One is on Métis Child and Family Services. We are an Aboriginal family resource center in Edmonton. We deliver 8 programs, and we've been in business for 32 years. The second series of slides I have is just a history of the Aboriginal journey in children's services over the last 20 years. Our mission statement is to promote the health and well-being of our children and families by building on the capacity of the Métis community through the provision of culturally sensitive and appropriate programs and services. We work very hard to ensure that the gifts of the grandfathers and grandmothers are used by our workers when they provide services to children and families, and they're treated in a respectful way. And we ask that other people working with our population give us the same respect. Our objectives are, and they have been since day one, to improve the quality and effectiveness of social services to Aboriginal children, develop and provide programs that preserve the strength of Aboriginal families, and we've struggled to maintain our anonymity as distinct people. And also to develop an Aboriginal awareness and responsibility for the well-being of Aboriginal children and families. And this is the one issue that really brings me here, because I don't think we've been providing that. Just a selfie. Just getting the hang of this. You can tell our board members, we have an all Indigenous or Aboriginal board, and all management positions are Aboriginal. Jack White is a Métis elder, veteran. Luella Massey is an Aboriginal program manager at Norquist College. Joel Rondell is a long-time foster parent, Métis elder. Alana Green is a social worker who works with the Solicitor General in the Family Support Program. Bridget Stevenson is a Métis elder, and she sat on the Community Board of Directors for Mumawee Capital Region for 6 years until the boards were disbanded. and the organization changed. Debbie Houle is a program manager at Indigenous Affairs. We deliver 8 programs, and they're all interconnected. Aboriginal Child and Family Support Program is an in-home family support program. Aboriginal Family Services is for families that have a couple of issues they want to work on, and they walk in through the front door and we can provide that services to them. Family Violence Program, Justice Program, and these 4 programs are connected, and the workers in each program will share a selection of those cases as the cases are assigned. Community Follow-Up Program in PSECA, that's the protection of sexually exploited children, or the old protection of children involved in prostitution. We've been in it since 1998. Choices Program is to stay in school. The Aboriginal Intervention Program was the old family intervention program they had 25 years ago. We've never changed the program or the way we deliver services within that program. Our program write-up has changed as the changes in children's services has happened, but the delivery of services has stayed the same. Aboriginal Family Services is funded by FCSS. It's preventative in nature, and it's a walk-in program for those who are struggling with issues and whatnot, loss and grief, advocacy, youth support, informal counseling, and just looking to access other community services, and they're just a little bit afraid to go out and access them. Family Violence Program. Yes. It assists individuals who are exiting abusive situations. Our caseloads in this program are really high, and we find that nobody walks in through the front door with a family violence concern or an issue. They come in looking for other services. Our people are proud. And usually as we work with them and build that confidence, these problems come out. And what we do is we work to put those supports in. We build a safety plan for them. We make sure that they have an exit plan. A lot of times we have to go into court and get protection orders and whatnot. And then we see if we can provide some services or provide some contact with the offender, and we find that very difficult within our community. Our justice program, we have 2 workers, and I think they did about 700 court appearances last year, and this is mainly for advocacy and for helping our people transit through the court system, and then we will provide the follow-up care after they leave the system. Health for Two is a prenatal program for young mothers. We just provide those necessary materials and supplies and information they need. Community follow-up program. Collaboration with Alberta Child and Youth Services, working with youth and youth identified in high risk and sexually exploited situations. We find a lot of the young people now are working off a computer, working off a back page, and they're not out on the streets like they used to be, and we engage them. We provide support, advocacy, a fair bit of youth work, informal counseling. We find them education opportunities, we find them a place to live, we find them training and whatnot, and just see if we can move them away and provide them with a safe outcomes, and maybe moving them forward within a lot of their family dynamics and whatnot. Foster care, kinship is our bread and butter, really. We have about 140 kids in care. We're happy to be able to provide services to our community children and whatnot. We demand a lot of our foster parents, and we ensure that they are culturally connected and they do take the cultural training that they need to keep our kids connected to their culture. Métis Jiggers, they've been around for 14 years. We started them, and just as a program for youth in the community, and when Heritage Canada was still providing funding to the Aboriginal community, we were providing dancing lessons in 4 schools, music lessons in 4 schools as part of the curriculum, and then when the funding dried up, we went back to just providing a dance program on Sunday afternoons. We provide a lot of support in the community, and we do have our teepee and our Métis tent, and we have a full range of other tents and whatnot where we help out communities provide functions and activities. Next weekend we will be helping St. Albert provide Aboriginal Days. Okay. So how do I? Okay, good. Okay, main reason I come here. Okay, back in 1997, the Office of the Commissioner of Services for Children and Families was formed, and they decided that they would redesign children's services, and they would build it on 4 pillars. The pillar that I was most concerned with was the Aboriginal pillar, in which Aboriginal people were going to be allowed to plan and manage services to our communities. We were going to be allowed to deliver services, and we were going to be consulted and allowed to play a big part in the lives of our children and our families. Just a little picture here of Pearl Callahazen, the Associate Minister of Aboriginal Affairs in 2000, when they set this plan in motion, and a bit of the executive summary of what the promise was at that time and how we would be included. And it referred to the standards of services for children and families. In that was about a 14-page booklet that laid out how services would be delivered to our children and families by the government. And keeping with that, they had broken down children's services authorities into 18 areas. The area that I was in was the Greater Edmonton area, and they gave all these authorities a board of directors. That was 5 Aboriginal members and 5 non-Aboriginal members, and each authority had an Aboriginal name, and we were called Mamawee Capital Region. And as a community member, we were very encouraged. We felt that we had finally been heard, and we were going to participate and take part in looking after our children and families, and doing it in a way that was culturally acceptable to our people. At the time, we had great leadership. Steve Brown was the CEO at the time, and he was very enthusiastic about pushing it, even though we did have an awful lot of pushback from children's services workers and the agencies, because the Aboriginal program standards demanded that anybody working with Aboriginal children had to have Aboriginal awareness training, that each agency had to provide an Aboriginal worker or an Aboriginal resource person for Aboriginal children and families that they were working with. And the one that sort of killed our impetus was that their ratio of staff to patients had to be equal. So if 70%, like it is now, of your staff is, or if your patients are Aboriginal, then 70% of your staff had to be. And that was just unachievable. But they pushed on, and we did form an Aboriginal Service Providers Committee in Edmonton to allow us to have our input into the strategic planning on how programs and services would be delivered and whatnot. And we enjoyed participating in that for about 2 years, and then it was discontinued. And our redesign of children's services lasted until they brought in the Alberta response model in 2002. And that sort of morphed into the Child, Youth and Family Enhancement Act in 2004, which still kept on alluding to our inclusion in delivering services to our children and families, a focus on supporting families to build capacity, on the need for permanency of children, and meaningful consultant with Aboriginal communities, and highlighting the importance of assessment, collaboration, and engagement. The problem we found was that the attrition rate with children's services was about 40% at the time, and as they brought on new workers, they were on such a learning curve they would never catch up with all the changes going on in the program. So in 2006 we had the casework practice model, which was another shift, and we still figured in the business plan they were going to give more meaningful early involvement to us, and they were actually going to let us use a resource person and do the social work job with our people. This is just from one of the Mamawee or Greater Edmonton business plans. This was in 2007, and at that time we had 4,275 children in contact with children's services in the Greater Edmonton area. And all the business plans over about a 5 or 6 year period through there basically had much the same numbers. Towards 2009, 2010, they redid the business plan again, and their outcomes this time, they hope that our community would have increased support to represent ourselves in child intervention cases, and our children would receive culturally appropriate services. And that led into your predecessor, the first Child Intervention Panel, and I believe we had a very well-intended group. We certainly had the experts there. We had Gayla Rogers, who was Dean of the U of A at the time. I had a great deal of respect for her. And they presented their recommendations, and the government accepted the majority of them. And my concern was that they were not really acted on. And we were still concerned with the attrition rate. And the big problem we felt was they were hiring maybe not the appropriate people to work with our children and families. And at that time, the ministry seen fit to form a working group called the Aboriginal Recruitment and Retention Leadership Team, which I happen to be a part of, and my elder and friend Jerry Woods was, and Elder Elvina Strasberg, who was one of the co-chairs of the redesign of Children's Services 20 years before. And I devoted 3 years to that, and it was rejected, flat out. They spent a lot of money designing it and whatnot, and it didn't float. Now I know that their attrition rate is 47% in less than 3 years. So the problem we have is how many frontline workers do we actually have with good experience? I can understand they're getting burnt out because you have all these program changes coming. And this one here was just last year when they reorganized and went to Human Services. And I just got to understand the org chart and figured out how to pull it off the internet when they switched back to Children's Services. And I had just about read all the Edmonton Regional Family Service restructuring plans. And they changed again. That's the Human Services that I didn't get much of a chance to figure out. And now this is, I believe, the Children's Services org chart. And org charts don't mean a lot at times. I think a lot of times they indicate that you do have an area of responsibility, and what I found is that the majority of the people are working very hard to justify their existence within that department. And a lot of times I think people don't look underneath. I think you have to look below the surface at times. And what I did with this org chart, I didn't put a slide up on it, but I drew a line underneath, and that was front line. That was the people that were delivering services to children and families. And then I dissected it down and sectioned off each one of those departments. And I asked 3 questions. What are they doing? Why are they doing it? And what impact does it have on the boots on the ground, the front line? And I found it didn't have a lot of impact on the way we delivered services to children and families other than providing a funding level. I guess that's the end of my show. We've had several changes since I had made that up. One of the big disappointments I have is that in 2000